just you and I, hey, together forever. In love.
Welcome back, everyone. For today, I'm here joined with Khalil of the wonderful and strange Twin Peaks Vlogcast, who you might remember from my Doc Hayward and Dick Tremaine episodes. And today we're here to discuss Annie Blackburn, but before we go too much further, I'll hand over the mic so he can introduce himself further.
Hey everyone, my name's Khalil. You can find me on the wonderful and strange Twin Peaks Vlogcast, where I've covered all of Twin Peaks episode by episode with a friend who had never seen the show before. And we covered everything, all the books, all the David Lynch films, the Twin Peaks cards, the Twin Peaks Gazette, hours and hours of special features from the Z-Dag collection. So ever since completing that project, I don't know, like a year and a half ago, 2 years, maybe it's been, I don't even know how time is happening. Ever since completing that, I've been mostly stepping away from the world of Twin Peaks, focusing on my YouTube channel. You can find me on Snake Eye Dreams, making video essays about surreal 90s anime, and as well as some animations from like the West in America, like Teen Titans, Batman the Animated Series, and Steven Universe, doing a lot of like long form analytical content. With more projects on the way. So thank you once again for having me on the podcast. It's great to be back in Twin Peaks.
Oh, and I agree. And I think the first thing we should start off by saying is that because we're going to start off with the final dossier, you and me, we both agreed before recording that we're going to try to only talk about Vivian, and we're not going to talk about the separate mother because that is a whole can of worms that I am honestly not ready to talk about. So for the sake of talking about Annie and her family life, we'll be talking about only Vivian, pretty much as she's presented in season 2. And then I think that's it. Anything we should mention before we really dive into the final dossier and Annie's life growing up?
I'll say going in that my main perspective and approach here is to look at a character like Vivian as she affects Annie, right? So all of her effect on like Norma or other characters or her presence at other aspects, I will let you approach at some other time. Have fun. Knock yourself out. I'm mostly interested right now in Annie as a character, and I will spoil this to say that I don't expect by the end of this conversation to have a neat, tied up in a bow sort of feeling on Annie Blackburn. She's a character that's left me rather, I wouldn't even say mixed. I like Annie Blackburn. I've always liked her since my first viewing, but as I look back at the material, I think she becomes for me the poster child case of a character that I don't think ultimately was written very well, but in spite of those writing issues became meaningful to me as a viewer. And I know I'm not the only one who feels that way about Annie or other characters. And last time you had me on talk about Dick Tremaine, he's mostly a joke character. He's mostly silly. We can find some serious elements to him, but I think whether you like Dick Tremaine or not boils down to, do you think he's funny? With Annie, I think the approach and appeal to her character is very different. At least for myself, I find Annie meaningful in the sense of what I think she can stand for and how I might, as a viewer, relate to her character or find her character interesting. So I am going to be a bit more serious and probably somber on this one because unlike Dick Tremaine, we talked about a little bit off pod, there's hardly any humor or joy in Annie's life. Whether you're talking about season 2, the little bit we get after, or the bit we get before Twin Peaks even started in the final dossier, her life, I remember in the book, it's like described as like lamentable. Her tale is just all of woe and misery time and time again. She might be in a cast of characters in all of Twin Peaks that have miserable existences and a lot of trauma and despair. Annie might be in the top 5, maybe even number 1 character who has a dark life. And it's something that I think when we're confronting a character like that, it does change the tone of the conversation. So that's my approach going in, just to say a little bit about that.
Oh, yeah, no, I agree. And I guess to build off what we were saying before is that I would generally agree that characters like her and also John Justice Wheeler, they were, even though they were written in to be like secondary romantic interests for Dale Cooper and Audrey, I would also agree with you that they were kind of written in, there's like a rushed aspect to it. But at the same time, I feel like they happen to work out for me. We'll talk about it further once we get to season 2. But I just want to say is that I do generally agree with you on where you stand with Annie and what she contributes to the story at large. But I guess to start at the very beginning, we start off where she was born as Annie Smith, And she was, according to Tammy Preston, born in 1973 and grew up in and around the motel called the Weary Traveler. Now, I got to be honest, we're off to a really bad start with Tammy because if she was born in 1973, that would make her 15, if not 16 years old by the events that when Cooper would meet her. So I guess that, since we're talking about like Final Dossier and how a lot of stuff doesn't hold up under scrutiny when it comes to continuity, should we mention this as like almost like it sets the tone for how much we should or should not believe of Annie's story as we go through the Final Dossier?
I struggle with this. Today, in this moment in time, I'm choosing to believe most of this account to be likely pretty accurate, but this just shows that the details can be fuzzy. And in general, time seems to be a specific issue with the secret history. Among all the inconsistencies and incongruities of those books, it feels like continuity in time and years and ages, it's one of the most consistent discrepancies. So there is an argument to be made that there's the discrepancies involving time and there's the discrepancies involving the other things. And maybe a lot of the time ones are just accidents in writing. Maybe it's something that wasn't even an intentional disparity. But if I'm asked how old I think Annie is, I am going to believe more accurately the depiction of the show than I'm going to believe the depiction in the book in terms of her age. I don't believe she came back to Twin Peaks as a 16-year-old, or however old that would actually be. So I don't want to do math right now. That's what I'm saying.
No, that's totally fine. Because I think for me, because we were talking about how we want to talk about only Vivian, not the second mother that was introduced in the Mark Frost books, and on top of that, we have the wrong age. Because for me, like when I was doing my research on this yesterday, I was just kind of thinking, I was like, maybe I should take a lot of this with a grain of salt. But at the same time, when it comes to the conflicts that Annie's presented with, it seems like it checks out well enough. Like there's not anything you can say like this categorically did not happen. I figured it was good to mention that. But I guess to build off from like, when Annie was born is that, her mother was Vivian Smith and that her father, Marty Lindstrom, not only was she not in the picture, Vivian said that she, of all things, that Marty was her uncle, which is already just kind of a weird starting point. And then also Norma, she didn't even learn that she had a half sister, a half sister being Annie until 1984. Norma kept it from Hank and even Ed. But once Norma and Annie did meet, that they would actually form a strong bond instantly. So is there anything we should talk about, like how Norma factors into this? Because Norma is like obviously a major component for Annie's life, from this point on.
Before we even get to Norma, I did have a few other thoughts kind of regarding this early childhood stuff. And even to respond a bit more to your question, maybe the way I would say in this moment is that the secret history and the Final Dossier present us with a version of events, and maybe the most likely version of events, but authenticating it proves to be difficult or impossible. So that's how I'm approaching it, where I don't take it to be the gospel. I take it to be, this is most likely what happened. And whenever you say most likely, there's that little bit of wiggle room that maybe we got a little bit off, but we don't have anything to contradict that would indicate otherwise. So this is probably what happened. So with that grain of salt kind of added in, what I think is also interesting here is that the picture we get of maybe a bit of home life, if you can even really call this a home, is that we know that Vivian not only had these, relationships and cheating and kind of machinations, but that she was also taking her anger out on Marty. So growing up, her main parental figures were an uncle who wasn't really her uncle, being like harassed and abused by this woman who was seen as her mother. So just as far as how that affects Annie's psyche, going back to what you're saying about Norma, every adult that presumably she's met in has been either a passing stranger, and the only consistency in her life has been figures of abuse and harassment. And I don't believe, given from the book and what we see in the show, that Vivian would have shown Annie any kind of motherly kindness or parental kindness. I also do want to briefly zoom in on the name of the motel being called the Weary Traveler. Of course, you can connect this to Twin Peaks as a whole, but I do think it's interesting within the context of Annie that she, in her life, passes through these different spaces and places as a traveler. I oftentimes see Twin Peaks regarded as her home. Like, I think even on the Twin Peaks wiki, it's the return to her hometown of Twin Peaks. I don't necessarily know if I would agree with it being a home to Annie. I think it's the closest she maybe ever got, but she's always a passing through person. She's always someone just briefly staying in one spot before being moved to the next spot, often in very liminal transitory spaces. Whether you're looking at a motel, or you're looking at a hospital, or you're looking at a convent, all of which have these connotations, sometimes being compared to prisons or being compared to, like, I would argue, like the Red Room itself, these rooms that she just passes through as a traveler. And at the same time, the weary traveler is like the only constant at that time in her life, where she watches everyone else come and go around her. I'm thinking of Annie as someone who often says she feels like a stranger or feels isolated and alienated. This is one aspect of the book which kind of does gel with how the season 2 portrayal of her is, where I see Annie as someone who doesn't really have an idea of what it means to live a normal life, because everyone she runs into is just passing by her, and she gets these little impressions and glimpses of people, but her constants are not reliable. And so I think of this early childhood as being fundamentally so rocky that bringing it back to Norma, when Norma enters, this is probably the first time that she's had any idea of what it's like to live a relatively normal life, to actually get to know someone on a personal level. So beyond even just Norma, we know that she's a kind character from seeing her in the show. We know that she's nurturing to Shelley as well. But I think Norma would mean so much more to someone like Annie, even past what we get in the show, based on what we learn about her early childhood.
In the case with her early childhood, that she's not living in a conventional like type of like environment. That's always at a hotel in and around it. That not really anything stable about the environment she's in. And the thing is that she does get that stable environment like not long after this, but there's a major caveat to it, because yeah, at some point Vivian marries Roland Blackburn. I think it's only 6 weeks after Marty's death. And then Annie and Vivian do move out of the motel and into Roland's home, which is a suburban environment. And then Annie is sent to a Catholic boarding school weeks later. She has very good grades. She's considered a quote unquote bright and eager student. And like we were saying about Vivian, and what checks out with her in the show and the books is that only Norma came to visit Annie during this time. And the one thing I should mention is that this is another, I think, maybe not necessarily a inconsistency from Tammy, but I would argue it is that it says 3 years later in her senior year. This is when Annie is likely sexually assaulted by Roland on Christmas break. Now, I mean, obviously, there's going to be a lot of intense conversation going on here. Yeah, it's is that Roland, he was stormed out after being caught by Vivian, and he died in a car accident 15 minutes later that Vivian may or may not have been a part of. Now, there's a lot to talk about in terms of the shift in Annie's environment and in what she was dealing with Roland. But what did you think of all this first?
I suppose when I go back to it now, my main feeling is this sense of sadness that Annie as a character, as portrayed in the final dossier, just gets sadness, just tragedy after tragedy after tragedy, to the point where I lose the character, I lose the person, I only know the bad stuff. And the way that it's portrayed by Agent Tammy in the book, I assume that she had like friends at school to some degree. She was well liked, well respected, got good grades. We get the sense that she had some success. She has this relationship with Norma, but because of the nature of the dossier and what Tammy's interested in actually covering, all we get are the footnotes of trauma. And I'm just imagining like anyone's life, if we just diluted it to only their traumas. That's what I get out of the section with Annie, where it's like, it hurts to read, and you hope, like, at least I hope, that like somewhere outside the margins of the text, she had some laughs and smiles that we don't get to experience. Like, surely it isn't all this. Please. That's my emotional response. I do just want to mention as a quick aside with Roland Blackburn, he is the owner of a beer distribution company, it says, with a chiseled country club lout kind of personality and a drinking problem and a violent temper. I think it's interesting to know that in context of the teetotaling and prayer kind of line, where Annie has that little throwaway line in season 2 about the idea of how to get over like a hangover. And she has this idea of like, yeah, I recommend teetotaling and prayer. But I imagine amidst that like joking line, this is probably someone whose experiences with secondhand like alcoholism and what alcohol can do to someone, given that even in the Twin Peaksian sense, it is an altered state of mind, it is a drug of sorts. I imagine that there is kind of an element to her character history of being very wary of the consumption of something like alcohol and what it can do to a person. In season 2, it's just a little line to like, I think it's Harry Truman or something. Like it's a little tiny line, but I think it gets a little bit more significance in context of Roland Blackburn being so associated with beer and alcohol.
That's actually a really good observation, because when I was thinking of Roland, I was actually thinking that a lot of this stuff, both in terms of Annie's life at school and her life at home, is actually not unlike Laura, because with Laura, she's known for being like at the top of her class, she's brilliant, people seem to really like her, but then there's problems at home, mostly rooted at the father, and also, and I'm going by the secret diary on this one with Sarah, is that there's a passive mother. And it seems like there's to me, like when I think of the scene with Annie in bed with Laura in Fire Walk with Me, that those two actually have a lot more in common than I think it meets the eye. But yeah, it's a parallel that it's kind of hard for me to overlook. I wasn't sure how much of Laura you thought of, in this, like in context with this part of the final dossier.
There are ways in which I would say that Annie is a remixing or second glancing at a Laura type character. A lot of that I want to put a pin in for now and touch upon when we talk about her fate and kind of her history. But I think you did a great job summarizing that there are these very distinct parallels. And even past Laura, you have other characters who experience either firsthand or secondhand substance abuse and addiction, or physical abuse, sexual abuse. There's a current of it. Laura feels to be the originator of so much of Twin Peaks. She's the main example of all of it. But I think this puts Annie in the conversation with Laura and other people who have been hurt and have been, in some ways, really been discarded by society and on the fringes and on the margins, where people really don't know what's going on behind closed doors. And so it, to me, speaks to not only the similarity with Laura, but also a recurring theme throughout all of Twin Peaks. Because with Annie, there is a mixture, even though she's only in the show for a small portion and she's only in the books for a small portion, she is still emblematic of so much of Twin Peaks because she echoes Laura, like you're saying, and she is the combination of quirky small town pleasantries and eccentricities with spiritual attunement and something of strange and bizarre from the beyond, with also a personal history of real tragedy. That, there's a lot of things that make up Twin Peaks, but those three things I just mentioned are at the top of the ingredient list for Twin Peaks. And Annie embodies those things despite being a relatively minor character who is grafted into a position of very strong importance in season 2. So it's interesting to see Mark Frost through the book and through Tammy's coverage already echo that element that she is so attuned to Laura and the core of Twin Peaks, despite her relatively small screen time.
And to build off from the trauma that was inflicted on around Christmas break, it is also worth mentioning is that a day later, Annie did try to end her life by downing tranquilizers and slashing her wrists. Vivian would discover her and send her to the hospital, and subsequently the psychiatric hospital that Nadine happened to stay at for 6 months. And once again, only Norma visited. Yeah, like I said, it's like we were saying before, is that we're seeing basically the almost the cliff notes, if you will, of just the trauma and the trauma only of Annie's life. And this, I think you said it with with the Unplugged Professor on the on the Wonderful Strange Twin Peaks logcast. But it's like the Secret Diary. We have we see Laura in all these different facets of her life, like a day-to-day sort of thing. And you contrast that with Annie and how different it is that we're just seeing this secondhand through the perspective of Tammy Preston. Is there anything we should kind of keep in mind going forward, with that in mind?
Well, one thing that brings up is in terms of parallels, not just with Laura, but the psychiatric hospital where Annie was sent to in Western Washington is coincidentally the same one where Nadine and her mother had been treated years earlier. So you have a through line now with Nadine, who also had tried to end her life through other methods. And so you have not only the story of Laura here, but you have the mental health and isolation aspects of Annie. Because if you're going to make a list again of characters who have tragic lives, Nadine's got to be on that list too. Someone who like continuously, time and time again, falls into these circumstances of fate that seem to push her down and cause her failure and lack of success. And whereas Nadine has these elements that are comedic about her character and have levity, whether or not you think they're well done or not in season 2, regardless, she has those funnier aspects. Annie doesn't have that. And again, not necessarily better or worse, just different. So it's interesting to see not just a parallel with Laura here, but that little bit with Nadine, because we only have so many characters to connect Annie through with the show. So I think it's interesting that Mark Frost even evokes a similarity with Nadine at all. I would never have thought of those two characters together in any context just watching the show.
Yeah, no, neither did I. I actually forgot about the part with Nadine being at the same hospital years prior. But one of the things about before we get into the somewhat later life of Annie, well, it's like we were saying before, is that there's nothing to really say that there's nothing to contradict all these events that we're talking about. But I think it's worth mentioning is that Tammy, she writes down in the final dossier that 3 years later, in Annie's senior year, after Vivian marries Roland, does this kind of mess the continuity of Annie being 15, 16 years old by the events of 1989 in Twin Peaks? Because seniors, generally speaking, are 17, 18 years old. And again, this is yet another, just the years are blatantly wrong yet once again with Tammy. And it's just again, it's another thing to remind me of how much should we believe from her? Because, whether Tammy's going off of bad information or misreporting. And it's just something that's it's on the edge of my mind every time, she gets the timetables wrong.
All I'll really say, I guess, with that is if Annie gets the dates wrong because of bad information, I would hope if she is as skilled of an agent as we're led to believe throughout the narratives, that she would notice and remark on the discrepancy and just have a little aside note that, hey, by the way, these years don't add up. I know this, but a lot of times they just kind of quietly have errors that aren't acknowledged. That's where I start to question, is it really just bad sources if Tammy's not even recognizing it as bad sources? Is Tammy messing up? Or, as I am usually more prone to believe, is this something that is a mistake either on Mark Frost's part as the author or meant to contribute to an overall feeling that when you read this book, you do not know what time, year, or anything is? Is it purposeful obfuscation or is it a mistake? And I oftentimes, as someone who's not as huge of a fan of the Secret History and Final Dossier, I'm more prone to think it's a mistake, but I can never really prove either way. It's, I think, more interesting to believe it's on purpose, but I don't really know with specifically Annie if there's anything to speculate on if there are these discrepancies, because let's say, for example, it is on purpose that the years don't match up. I don't know what to do with that. I don't really know what it says about Annie's story. I'm going to believe at the end of the day that what happened probably happened, but maybe when it happened is a bit off, because otherwise I don't have a competing alternate theory of what happened to Annie to put against it. So it's I take it with a grain of salt at the end of the day.
It would be one thing if Tammy was just just some random FBI agent that happened to be reporting on this. But it's just that, in the return, Albert sits down and he talks about her credentials to her, about being at the top of her class and all these standout achievements that she did before entering the Blue Rose Task Force. So for me, it's just that, what I guess it's one thing for her to say born in 1973 and then kind of overlook that. But for her to say 3 years later in her senior year, and this is even going the fact that, everything we talk about before 1989, it just seems like there's just stuff that, within just a few pages apart from each other, Tammy should be thinking oh, this doesn't sound right. And again, maybe it's just Mark Frost just deciding to mess with the time periods just to kind of keep us on our toes. But it's just that, from the perspective of Tammy and her achievements, it's just hard for me to believe that she would make these just blatant issues within the same files, no less. To shift away from Tammy's inconsistencies for now, we should mention is that while Annie was in the psychiatric hospital, Vivian met Ernie at this time. And again, the timeline and story doesn't match because I know that in the season 2, I believe Ernie says that he says to Hank that he met Vivian at a Republican fundraiser, like after he got out of prison. Assuming he got out of prison somewhat early, like, within the like couple years before the events of Twin Peaks, and there is nothing pertaining to that in the final dossier. The bar is very low, but apparently Ernie was not much better to Annie than Roland was. But having said that, Annie promptly returned to school to finish up, and she finished up in that following spring. Tammy didn't really write about it in detail, but Annie favored going to a convent over college, and that Norma did not approve of this. Should we talk about anything about Annie's like latter high school days, or anything about what would prompt her to go to the convent, and also her conflict with Norma?
The first thing that jumps out to me with regards to Norma is that Norma very clearly had reservations about Annie going to this convent. She didn't think it was a very good idea. We don't necessarily learn why Norma didn't like the idea, but she didn't. And she kept quiet about it because she wanted Annie to be able to make her own decisions. That's how the text explains it. And what I think is interesting about that then is that Norma in her own life, as we see in the show, is someone who oftentimes falls into these choices and decisions that lead her to have these difficulties, but she's kind of trapped by her circumstances with like Hank and Ed and all the stuff going on with the diner. She's always being forced to have to make these tough decisions with like her double R and like the return. So I think it's interesting here, this idea of wanting to make sure that she makes the decision for herself. Kind of like how everyone in Twin Peaks knows that Norma should get rid of Hank as soon as possible and go with Ed. Everyone knows that, but Norma has to be the one to make that decision at the end of the day, I think would be the idea. So I think it's interesting here, that idea of like making sure Annie gets the right say, because it doesn't sound like Norma even talked to Annie and tried to reason with it. It sounds like Norma was like, well, I don't agree, but I am not going to even bring this up to try to argue against it. I think that's interesting as like a character angle, because I can see other people and other characters in this situation sitting them down and trying to explain. Like I go back to Doc Hayward from a previous episode recorded. If Donna was about to go run off to a convent, right, I would think her parents would sit her down and explain to her, like, Donna, we love you and we want you to make the best decisions for yourself, but we have some concerns about your future and we wanted to understand better why you want, like, I think they would ask questions and talk about it. Norma isn't her mom and is only connected in such a way that they're not as close as maybe she feels that it's her place to do that. But it is interesting to me that Norma did not step in and try to reason. Presumably, no one told Annie this was a bad idea. Presumably, the only voices that were saying anything to her were the people who wanted her to join the convent, either at the school or, as part of the convent admission. I don't know how convent admissions work, but I assume there's people trying to like sell you on the idea, right? She probably only had yes men.
That's actually not a bad point, because for me, I guess I'm thinking of like, we're obviously we spent some time on the trauma that Roland inflicted upon Annie, and also Ernie is in the picture, so the family life is already pretty unstable as it is. And I think for her, it's like, with everything that she's been going on and Vivian just not being a good mother to her, that she just kind of wanted to get away from it. And I think that Norma, there's always that part of me that wishes I could like know more about this, from another perspective. But I could see Norma not approving it, because Annie, was one of the brightest students at this school and probably could have gone very far if she like went to college and like, I don't know, mid late 80s, and like, found like a real career to kind of like do something. Because when we talk about Norma and like how she runs the double R, it never feels like she really like she's accepted it and she likes the people that are there. But I think there's that part of her, at least early on, that was like, it was a bit begrudging. And this would be around the time when it would be on the more begrudging end for her. So I think that's her trying to look out to see, she sees the potential in Annie and wants her to live that full potential. And that the convent is kind of like a reverse part of it, where, on one hand, it does protect Annie, but at the same time, it insulates her to like an alarming degree. Before we get into anything veering away from the final dossier for now, was there anything we should keep in mind going forward with Annie and her dynamic with Norma?
I actually, just to go back, I do have more thoughts on your question before about what it might reveal that Annie would go to this convent. Kind of as you're talking, I was thinking about this, where given what we know of Annie's life and that she was spending most of her time at this Catholic boarding school, she's used to living there, right? That's more of a home to her than anything involving Roland, Vivian, or Ernie. right? And given that her early childhood, most foundational, fundamental years were spent in a hotel, I also look at the convent as some form of synthesis between these ideas, because a convent is like a dorm. It is like a hotel where people stay permanently in these isolated rooms. That's what she knows. I don't think like a more typical housing situation would even be familiar to her, because the place that she stays with Vivian and Ernie and Roland is dark history, and it's not where she wants to be. So I think like if I was looking at it from Annie's perspective, all she's ever known that's been kind of a sanctuary and refuge have been these places like a convent, that she might want to be gravitating toward that decision. There's also the element of her spirituality. The dossier doesn't go too much into detail about it, but we're led to believe that Annie genuinely is religious, and probably up there in terms of Twin Peaks characters that are really into their Christian faith, probably up there with like the Briggs family. I think that's like really our main gravitational forces as far as Christianity in Twin Peaks. So I believe it's probably a synthesis of not really knowing what else to do, feeling like this is the most familiar and safe option, as well as a genuine interest in spirituality and growing that inner world. We know that in season 2, there's that link with Cooper over this idea of growing in a spiritual way. So I look at it almost as a subversion or inversion of Cooper. Cooper, his way of gaining spiritual insight is to travel the world, is to go to all these places, not just to learn about Tibet, but to go to these, like, I think it's in My Life, My Tapes, like he goes to like islands and he like seeks out like information and ideas, not just as part of work, but also to gain this spiritual insight. Whereas it's almost the opposite for Annie. She closes herself in and goes inward. I think that's an interesting little element there at play.
I didn't even think about that with Cooper and Annie in terms of the contrasting how they kind of deal with their beliefs. But yeah, that's actually something I got to think about, like as we once we get to their romance in season 2. But I think to veer away from the final dossier for the moment, even though it's out of continuity, for lack of a better term, with Annie, I feel like now is a good time to talk about her scene Fire Walk with Me and Laura's dream. Near the end of this dream, Laura, she's presented with the ring. Cooper says, don't take the ring. And she quote unquote wakes up. And Annie's laying in her bed and she's completely, at least seemingly unfazed by it. But, she's in Caroline's dress. She's bloody. And she tells Laura about the good Dale in the lodge and that he can't get out and to write it in her diary. Of course, at this point, no, she's presented with the ring. And I'll get to that when we get to the season 2 finale. But I do want to talk about Annie telling about Laura about the good Dale, because it's not clear in the movie, because she already sees Harold Smith for the quote unquote last time, like earlier on. But the thing is that Laura clearly does write it down as we see it in The Return, because Frank Truman and Hawk are going through it 25 years later. And we can talk about the semantics, a little bit if you did want, about the secret diary and how the pages are still preserved at this point. But it is worth mentioning that Laura did clearly write this down, and what Annie said had clear ramifications from the story going forward. Should we talk about anything about Annie and Laura and like everything surrounding this at the moment?
The thing that most strikes me is that this is an example of Annie being mostly used as a plot device. This is Annie not reaching out to Laura as someone who's gone through similar trauma. It's not someone reaching out as a friend or like offering assistance, or someone like, hey, I'm here to listen to you. This is someone saying, I have a piece of lore to give you. I have plot important information that you don't know about, but the viewer knows about, and it's important for the viewer to have this. So it's like a Deus Ex Machina, I suppose, in a way. They just throw in an Annie going through time and space to deliver some information as setup. It does raise the question, if there had been more Twin Peaks in the 90s, what would have been the ramifications of Laura writing this in the diary? Because there's very little in Fire Walk with Me that takes place after season 2, but it is there. And in the missing pieces, it is even more there. So it makes you wonder, like, if there had been another Twin Peaks movie or a season 3 following Fire Walk with Me in the 90s, maybe this would have mattered more, and maybe it would have been more significant. But it really feels to me like, and this could be wrong, but it feels to me like on the writing room, they were looking at, we need a way to get Laura to write this in the diary for something we're going to do later. How is she going to know about this? And the idea of using Annie to do it came up. I don't know if it says much about Annie herself, as much as the missing pieces scene we'll discuss later shows a bit more of what actually is going on with Annie. But what we get in Fire Walk with Me, to me, it could have been anyone. It's just Annie was the most apt vehicle.
Honestly, I guess, I have to concede with you on that because I know that in the original script, it was Del Cooper that was going to be in the bed with her, and he was going to kiss Laura, which, by the way, I'm glad that David Lynch and Bob Engels opted for
Yeah.
that. And more specifically, that Kyle MacLachlan didn't want to be in Fire Walk with Me at that point. So I think that having Annie at least makes that scene feel, for a dream as uneasy as that one was, it does make it a lot more palpable to go through. And we'll expand on this later, but I think the fact that the ring, I think that Annie is much more affiliated with the ring than I think that that I initially realized before I did my notes. So I did want to say that even if it is from a plot device perspective, she does actually have a huge part not only for Laura's story because of Laura's involvement with the ring, but also that what Laura would write down her diary because of Annie. That this is a major plot component in the return as well. But to return to, I guess, Annie's normal time, for lack of better phrasing, is that Annie does reach out to Norma after she has second thoughts about the convent. And this is what leads into season 2. Of course, Shelley's not the double R at this point. I will say, though, is that Tammy is once again wrong because she refers to all these events of Annie being at the double R to Wyndham Earl's abduction as a few weeks. And again, because I think that's the last of the major inconsistencies I have for Tammy and Annie's section. But no, I guess, now that we're in season 2, that Annie arrives at the double R to meet Norma. And instantly, I think this says a lot about how they feel about their mother, is that when they come in, I think they do talk about it. And then Annie says, do you want to talk about good things or do you want to talk about her mother? And then Norma opts to talk about good things. And the things that Annie meets Shelley and she says, I know all about you. And Annie looks at Norma's like, she knows all about me. And Norma says, Shelley's family here. I mean, to be fair, it seems like Annie brushes it off after that, but I figure it's probably also something worth mentioning about how much Shelley knows about Norma at this point, because it's like I was saying before, is that she kept this from Hank when the marriage was quote unquote going well. She kept it from Ed, which, depending on the timeline, maybe that was easier because they weren't seeing each other as often. But that says a lot about Shelley, that she knows about Annie. And it seems like she knows about the darker parts of Annie, as it implies in that scene.
I'm just struck by what this might indicate about Annie's self-concept, because if most people were in a situation where family visited and someone's like, oh yeah, I heard all about you, their response isn't going to be all about me. What do you know? Most people don't have the impulse, I wouldn't think, that the phrase, oh, I know all about you is dangerous or scary. I think it says something potentially that Annie thinks that all about her equals bad stuff you don't talk about. Her entire self-concept of who she is something you don't just talk to people about. That's gotta weigh on you, mentally, to think that she's that kind of burden or that kind of taboo, that it can't just be, oh, she doesn't assume that what it means is, oh, I told Shelley that you're my sister or half sister and that you just got back from a convent and you like to read and you're really nice and you got a good sense of humor. She takes it to be you told her things that we shouldn't talk about, which, if that's your whole self-image and self-concept, I think that says something about how Annie thinks of herself. Also, just as a few little side notes, because I know we're going to move on from this pretty quick, I think it's interesting that the episode where Annie is first mentioned before she appears is the episode that later got the title The Condemned Woman, because most likely The Condemned Woman is a reference to Josie. But given the context of Annie, I think you could argue Annie is a condemned woman as well, through events we're going to get way later and learn about from her past as well. Also, again, minor thing potentially, but if you want to read into it, and I'm kind of apt to read into it, the concern over the phone that Annie has with Norma is whether that there's room for her. And Norma reassures her, yeah, I've got plenty of room. It'll be all right. And I think it's interesting, this recurring theme of having a room, having a place to live, having a space to call her own, which, again, calling back to that theme of being back to these different locations, Norma says over the phone, a convent isn't a prison. You can just leave. That makes me think of the Red Room. Because that's also like a prison. And can you just leave that? I don't know. Both are spiritual places that you learn about yourself, but maybe it's not so easy to walk out of them. And when you go, maybe it follows you, et cetera, et cetera. So there's like a little bit of a breadcrumb trail that I don't know if it was intentional. I'm probably reading into very small things. But if you are making meaning out of Annie's narrative, the little tiny emphasis on places to be, places to say, rooms become a recurring theme throughout the motels, the convents, and et cetera.
That's a great observation. I didn't even think about the parallels of the Red Room with the convent, because when I was thinking about these interactions with Shelley, I was thinking more so about how it's Annie's first time being back out in the real world and how she might not be able to react to certain things. Yeah, I mean, going forward, that's actually a really great observation. And actually, I think, and again, well, I'll talk about more in the season 2 finale, but you're starting to make me think differently of one particular scene. It is before they go into the Red Room. But I guess also now is a good time, Zane, to talk about, because a lot of the stuff that we'll be talking about from season 2 for a while now is going to be about her relationship with Cooper. And we should probably talk about the context behind this, because I think at this point it's kind of widely known that after Leland's death, they're going to spend like, I think, 5-ish episodes at least dedicated to Cooper and Audrey's romance. But of course, Kyle MacLachlan put his foot down for one reason or another, and they had to create John Justice Wheeler for Audrey and then Annie for Cooper. Should we talk about like if that's like a hindrance of sorts? Because I know there's people that actually don't like Annie Blackburn because of this, because they feel like she's so shoehorned in. I will concede that, yeah, she was written in a very secondary manner. And also even Harley Payton, he actually like scoffed at the idea of her being at a convent, like in the writing process. I think his mannerisms, I forget if it's in The Essential Wrapped in Plastic or Reflections, but I think his general takeaway was like who the hell would go to a convent in the 80s sort of thing. I think we should keep mind regarding like Annie and Cooper though.
There's a whole lot that we could get into, some of which is documented, pretty agreed upon, some of which is speculation as far as the hows and whys. And I don't want to step on any toes as far as other episodes you may have done in the past or have planned that involve Dale Cooper or involve the characters of Audrey and et cetera, or John Justice Wheeler, obviously. But regarding Annie specifically, I think there's this inescapable looming elephant in the room that Annie was manufactured for a purpose. In at least one sense, maybe multiple, depending on your interpretive lens. And from just a pragmatic standpoint, even if you take the stance of death of the author, even if you just try to treat the work as its own thing, it's hard to completely ignore the fact that Annie and John Justice Wheeler clearly enter the show for that purpose of being new romance interests. And so the question for, at least I think, and maybe for a lot of viewers, becomes, if that's the fact, if they're born out of a narrative necessity, is there something interesting done with them with that idea in mind? Like, are they utilized well if that's going to be the originating point? Because a lot of great elements in fiction are born from necessity. Something had to happen, and then you do something creative with it. So that's going to be kind of the litmus test that I would use as far as the success of a character like Annie. Yeah, she was made to fill this one role. Is she anything more than that, or is she just that role? And that's also where I would look at characters that maybe don't resonate as much with me in The Return or in The Secret History. I might be looking at that character and be like, oh, yeah, they're fine, but they feel just like a plot device. They feel like they're there just to move along something. I don't really get to know them as a person. And that becomes a question with Annie. Is there enough there, either actually in the text of the show and books, or is that a case where maybe we can make a meaning out of it and find a way to connect or not? Because I understand perfectly, I think, someone who would dislike Annie, because on the face of it, she is a replacement for Audrey, and a lot of people really liked the Audrey Cooper romance angle. I personally do not. I personally think it would have been a bad choice to have Agent Cooper date someone who is in the narrative in high school, even if I believe Heather Graham was actually in real world, like, younger. But in terms of the characters of the narrative, I think it would be bad for Cooper's character. And that's with all respect to those who disagree. It's a, pretty even split, I think, within the fan base. I just look at it as right off the gate, Annie's put in a tough spot by being this replacement for Audrey. Does she rise above that or not? For me, she does.
I would actually agree with that as well, because I did a John Justice Wheeler episode last year, and even though I do like Billy Zane that role, and I generally like the character of John Justice Wheeler, his romance with Audrey, his main purpose just did not land for me. His Ben Horn scenes land for me, but not like the reason why he was there for Audrey. But Annie Blackburn, on the other hand, I think that her and Dale Cooper, they have a generally actually rather good romance, and also just the way that Annie fits into the framework with like the mythos, and there's this like I feel like there's like almost brushes of an esoteric nature to her, because it's not when Annie's on screen, but I'm pretty sure Norma says it to Shelley that it seemed like Annie was always in her own world, that she was just kind of just away from like the general public in a sense. So I think just that little line in of itself, it was built off upon pretty well from this point in season 2 onward. And also it helps the fact that, you know, by this point, we're getting away from like most of the bad subplots of season 2. So Annie is actually becoming more important as the show gets better, in my opinion.
The way I read it is that John Justice Wheeler is an embodiment of part of what Audrey saw in Cooper, and that's someone who has been around, been traveled, someone who represents adventure. And that's kind of the adventure and intrigue that she's wanting, not from Cooper now, but from someone like John Justice Wheeler. And Annie represents sort of this spiritual, sort of inward aspect that she's a bit different. She's a bit eccentric. She's her own person. And I think that's a bit of what Cooper saw in Audrey, not the religious angle, but the angle that Audrey saw the world in a different way, that she had her own perspective and she felt something. When she's dancing to the music that no one else hears, that is something I think that has a through line with Annie. Not that it's one-to-one with music per se, but they are tapping into senses that maybe others don't realize. What I guess I would put out to anyone listening, and maybe to us as well, is that thought experiment. If Audrey Cooper was never, ever going to, like, we never even had the idea that those two were going to be teased as a romance. Let's say Audrey existed in the show, but she just doesn't have a lot of scenes with Cooper. There's no indication that was even going to be a setup. How would we feel about Annie? Because if Annie still showed up this late into the show, but Cooper never had a prior romance angle, like there was never anyone before even like remotely set up, and Annie was the first one and the only one, I think people would be a lot more favorable on Annie.
I know that it's a low bar because, again, we're comparing because they're romance interests, but I'm thinking of that scene with John Justice Wheeler and Audrey. Like, their last scene together is right before his plane's about to take off, and Audrey says, like, make love with me, I'm a virgin. We never reach any levels of just, like, secondhand embarrassment dialogue like that with Cooper and Annie. In fact, actually, it's probably a good time as any to talk about the I guess the buildup of their romance, because, you know, on Annie's second day at the Double R, she meets Cooper and there's like an instant attraction. And again, it's another like, you know, him, the coffee's just right. And, you know, it seems like they hit it off. And then I think it's like the day after that. And this is actually one of my favorite scenes in season 2. It's when Annie takes Cooper and Truman's orders at the Double R. And this is when Cooper tells the penguin joke. He makes her laugh. Truman actually says to Cooper outright when Annie's not there that he can tell that there's something different about Cooper when he's around Annie because he just told a joke. And Cooper is completely oblivious to it. He's like, I did? And that's not even going to the fact that all this other great stuff that's going on, such as Goran Cole talking to Shelley or the log lady being there. There's just a lot of great stuff in that scene. I think that this is the scene. If there's one scene that sells me on the romance with Annie and Cooper, it's just the whole vibe of the scene and how those two really start to connect at this point.
Yeah, and never underestimate background music too. It's a very like positive feeling scene in connotations. Everyone's laughing, everyone's having a good time, and the music is cheerful as well. I do have a few notes here. It's interesting that like Dale Cooper immediately, as soon as he sees Annie, is taken aback by her appearance and has like nervous jitters before even like knowing her. And I think there's two main ways you can read that. One is physical attraction, pure and simple. The other one is that there's something about like her aura. And what I would argue as well on that point is that maybe a good way to word it that I kind of am glancing at right now as we're talking is that maybe the through line between Audrey and Annie is that both of them were people that Cooper thought maybe we can be on the same frequency. And I'm going to use the term frequency deliberately because that's both music and also spiritual. I think the idea of being on the same frequency is maybe the thing that they have in common for Cooper, that hope that maybe we can tune into the same frequency together. On that note, it's interesting also that Annie describes herself, I think it's a little bit later, as stubborn, extremely willful. She says, I can't promise you I'll always make sense or do what you expect me to. That describes herself. It describes Audrey, and it also describes Dale Cooper. Extremely willful, stubborn, and not always going to make sense. Yeah, that's all three of them. So there is like something to be said that even though Annie and Audrey are definitely not the same character, there are enough overlaps to see where there are connections. Why Cooper might be interested in someone like this.
I totally agree. I think that if anything, because there's that quirkiness to Annie and Cooper, I think that in a lot of ways it works better than if it were Audrey. Because it's like you were saying before, is that in universe, there's that part when Cooper sits down when Audrey's in his bed. He says, "You're a high school girl. I'm part of the Federal Bureau of Investigation," and that there's a code that he lives by. And I think that makes sense for Cooper. I think that like what makes the allure of the Cooper and Audrey romance so good is that we didn't get it too much further. I think that if it could have easily outwore its welcome if they did pursue it. But I think with Annie, I feel like that even if she's written for secondary reasons, that it still fits in narratively really well. I think it is also worth mentioning is that this is another scene that we're going to talk about that Annie. I guess it's a little bit of a plot convenience, and also there's actually a blatant continuity error as well. Is that Cooper is sitting at the Double R diner. I think like it has to be the day after that. He has by this point he's talked with Major Briggs. He's talked with Margaret Lanterman, and they're talking about the the marks that they have on their body after disappearing, and he's combining them. And the thing is that when Cooper combines these images, Annie says that those look like the symbols from Owl Cave. And I guess to talk about the continuity part is that with Major Briggs, his marking is 3 triangles, but when he makes this drawing, it's actually diamonds. So I know I was ragging on Tammy a lot for like the continuity errors, but this is like a blatant continuity error within the universe of this particular, not of the show, but of this episode individually. Before we talk about Owl Cave and just like a lot of the mythos of Twin Peaks, should we talk about anything relating to the continuity of this part?
I look at it again as most likely just a mistake. I don't think there's any intention behind the mistake. And I personally don't read into it as having any extra meaning that like theory crafting could come up with. I'm sure there have been theories that make this make some form of sense. I'm thinking it was just an oversight or just something that got changed during production and development. I think if you scrutinize the show, you're going to find those every now and then. And I think, if anything, it's a testament to how much like fans love the show that we even notice stuff like this at all. Because I mean, if you take almost any other show, especially shows that went longer than 2 or 3 seasons, you're going to find these kind of things probably all over the place. Like, I don't doubt at the exact same point we're having this, there's people doing like X-Files podcasts or Lost podcasts, and they're noticing all these things where it's like glaringly obvious that like mistakes happened. But I think what's unique about the Twin Peaks audience, and maybe it's not the only fandom doing this, maybe the Lost and X-Files people do the exact same thing, but we will always try to find ways to make this fit. We're always going to try to like find something in there that makes it somehow matter or be relevant in some way. And I don't know if it necessarily always is. That's my hot take, I suppose.
No, I think you're on to some with that because I remember I was talking about a plot hole that I saw in Twin Peaks a few weeks back at the time of this recording. And John Bernardi brought up a really good point is that a lot of continuity wasn't really the forefront as it would be today. Because in the early 90s, I mean, of course, I mean, everyone's heard this before, but no one was doing what Twin Peaks was doing in the early 90s. So there's a lot of other things to worry about when you're going episode by episode. So continuity would fall by the wayside. But I at least thought that, of all the things we were talking about with Tammy, about her getting stuff just blatantly wrong, I at least thought it was at least like interesting to bring that up. But I do want to talk about how Annie, again, coming back to Norma saying that she was always in her own world, is that Annie knew about Owl Cave. And even like when you go down there with like Cooper and crew, is that they talk about how that cave has been untouched for so long. Even Hawk seems like it's a somewhat new thing. Like I think out of all of them, he knows more about Owl Cave than the rest of them. But even he talks about how it's kind of like territory that most people don't go into. But Annie seemed to know about it. Do you think that there's anything we should address in terms of Annie being like, I don't know, being more aware of like, I guess the woods of Twin Peaks, or just about like that there's something going on in the town that she seems to know to the point that she's actually seemed to visit this place previously?
This to me reads as like a gap in the text, so to speak, situation where it's interesting and kind of surprising that between the Secret History and Final Dossier, to my memory, there is not really anything establishing Annie as being especially knowledgeable about the woods around Twin Peaks. She's affiliated mostly with other parts of Washington in her early childhood, and her main connections are like Vivian, her, not very good father figures, and Norma. None of them are known for being very like attuned to the woods around Twin Peaks. So it's a curiosity to me. I think if I had to guess, one way you could try to rationalize it is that maybe she heard about it through Norma, who visits like people at the diner, and maybe there's people coming into the Double R diner who've been to these areas and like they know the area well. So like secondhand, third-hand knowledge, where like some patron, I'm going to say it's Toad because it's funny to believe it's Toad. Toad comes into the Double R and is talking about this hike he went on with his family, and they went by Owl Cave and it spooked him and he went away from it or something. And then Norma's talking to Annie randomly and it comes up in conversation. And maybe it says about Annie that she's the kind of person that would latch on to a minute detail and remember it like years later. I'm willing to headcanon that. That's possible. At the end of the day, I think it's more just they needed a vehicle for the story to pass through. And there's also room here for other theories about Annie, which I'm going to also put a pin in for this. But the theory that Annie might know more than she lets on, there is the argument that there is something to be said for Annie if she knows things that she shouldn't. But if we're going to do it in a grounded, real world kind of way, my best theory would be probably through Norma, through like a guest or patron at the Double R.
When I was mentioned before, and again, partially why I was bringing up, the glaring continuity errors on Tammy's part is like how much can we hold under scrutiny? Because I can totally buy into Annie being like that outcast when she's younger, and she kind of ventures in the woods and just finds all these things that most people her age like wouldn't really seem to find or even take interest in. Actually, I guess I'll mention now is that this scene was partially why I had this idea in my head that not that Annie would be a tulpa, but she was lodge adjacent in a certain manner because it just seems so convenient that Cooper would go to this place and like it would like further the story for both him and Wyndham Earle. A couple of years ago, like when I did my previous Annie episode, I did talk. I expanded a lot on that, and that was kind of my main crux. But I have turned around on it, and I think I've just chalked it up to, as we talked about with the final dossier, that that was all in Tammy's perspective, but on a more ground level, on a day-to-day life with Annie, that she's been to Twin Peaks, that maybe there's certain things about Norma and Annie's relationship that was not quite explained well in the final dossier, and that she has been to Twin Peaks before and was very familiar with the woods. And I guess I'm thinking of this offhand, but it's kind of like not unlike the way that Laura was well versed with the woods, as we saw in The Secret Diary, that maybe they just knew certain places that were important, like just intuitively. But I think that's kind of all I really have to say about the Owl Cave part. Was there anything we should talk about with Annie and her esoteric nature before we continue on Cooper's relationship?
Since you mentioned it, I suppose I'll unpin a little bit what I was going to say earlier about the tulpa idea. So in doing some research for this episode, I did glance at a Reddit thread called How's Annie? A Deeper Look into the Character, originally posted by the user Eunice Bikidden. That's their name. And just kind of pulling from some aspects of the conversation in that thread. What if the character we see was never the real Annie Blackburn? We know that Laura Palmer, like her, she has had her share of garmonbozia in her short life. And then it speculates, like, what if she was actually successful in her first suicide attempt? But for whatever reason, the ring at that time becomes trapped in the lodge. Now we're getting into like fan speculation that she's actually like the Annie we see in the show is not even like the real Annie. And they're talking about like lines of dialogue where she references that she's been out of circulation, which is a very particular phrasing. At one point, she describes herself feeling disoriented, not knowing where she is. And so they talk about like, yeah, there's reasonable explanations like with the convent, but like a lot of dialogue in Twin Peaks, her words could have an ulterior meaning. And so it gets to this point where they say, quote, I believe the character of Annie that we see in season 2 is a tulpa, deliberately sent by Bob to lure both Earl and Cooper into the lodge. I believe that the Annie we see in Fire Walk with Me is the actual true Annie, the soul that is trapped in the lodge. I believe that the entity that left the lodge in season 2 finale with the ring is the tulpa again, but this time the tulpa has no real purpose and thusly has never had any reason to interact with the world around her. So obviously there's going to be touching upon things we're going to talk about as we're going through this. But there are theories like this that are available if people are interested to look them up, where there are ideas that now that we've had the context of the return, to look back at a character like Annie and be like, wait a second, Is she a tulpa? Like, what is the blue rose-ish nature of this character that leads you down these rabbit holes? What I'll say about that now is my first and primary concern is about preserving what I see as like the humanity of Annie's character. And I worry about deviating so far into the theories about tulpas that I risk losing the person at the actual narrative. That being said, I don't blame anyone and don't think it's even a bad theory because it makes sense. There's enough of a through line with like Diane and with we know of Laura to actually ask these questions. It now makes sense to wonder that in a way that it wouldn't have necessarily made as much sense to wonder when the episodes originally aired in the 90s. But what I'll just say then is that when we're talking about the spiritual aspects of Annie, I generally assume that to be a case of a human being with a maybe higher attunement, the same way that Dale Cooper has like a higher attunement to these things. I still think she's probably a living, real human being. I don't think she's like an artificial person or a creation from the lodge, but theories like that can account for the information that she shouldn't know that she does and how often she feels like she doesn't belong anywhere because maybe she doesn't. Maybe this isn't actually even a person. I don't choose to believe that, but I think there's arguments for it.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I actually would have generally, if not completely, agreed with that sentiment. But I think there's just something about how Annie's faith is kind of touched upon, like, early on when she comes onto the show. But I feel like there's one particular scene later on that really, I feel like once I saw like how powerful her faith was, that it was kind of hard for me to think that that would be a tulpa or something more insidious. And we'll get to that when we talk about, her going to the Red Room. But I think for now, we should talk about how Cooper and Annie's relationship seems to get much more serious, like almost instantly, because after the finds an owl cave, and this is before, I'm pretty sure that before they know that Wyndham Earl was there, Cooper goes back to the Great Northern and he sees Annie there. And they're talking, and he notices her scars, and that's like, he starts to kind of see her, that there's something more going on. And even the next day, they go have a date out in the lake, and she opens up about her vulnerabilities, and then the ex-boyfriend is mentioned. And again, this is another one that seems like it's another trauma, not unlike Roland. And we're gonna dip back a little bit to her past, but is there anything we should talk about? About how her past is affecting her romance with Cooper at the moment?
In terms of like this middle or like later period of their relationship, like you said, it escalates and goes very, very quickly as far as their attachments to each other. The feeling I get here predominantly is this nervousness from Annie to accept what Cooper is offering and to reciprocate it out of that fear of being hurt again, out of that fear of danger. And I'm thinking of when they're at the Miss Twin Peaks stuff, and it's like right before the actual like ceremony and everything. And this makes me think about when they're having that invitation to dance and Annie gradually accepts, like it takes a little while for her to accept the offer, which I think you can take to be not just an aversion to dancing, but an aversion toward that level of intimacy, that she says that she doesn't want to actually do this. She's kind of nervous. And he says to just follow him. And she seems to say that they'll follow each other. And I take that to be kind of a broader picture on what they see in their relationships. Cooper is operating on this idea of, I will lead you, I will guide you, don't be afraid. And she's more asking for that idea of like mutual, reciprocal, like equal will follow each other, is how at least I'm reading kind of their wants and needs at this point. And there's this quote that she says around that time, quote, I understand why you hesitate, why you treat me with care. The convent invokes this image of helpless women, fearful of the thought of any emotion other than those derived from scripture and prayer. But when you hold me, when we kiss, I feel safe and eager. I'm not afraid, not of anything that you make me feel or want. And there's a lot of things you can do with, I think, some of those lines. The idea of I'm not afraid tying into the fear and love open the door kind of thing, as well as make me feel or want. I'm thinking of Mr. C. I do not need, I want. I'm thinking of all those different like buzzwords in there. But just in terms of the broad strokes of that sentiment, she's saying, I understand why you're cautious. You think I'm fragile. And I get that, but don't worry, like reassuring him that this feels safe and good to me. It's just going to take a little bit of time. And going back to that recurring idea of finding a home, finding a safe place, I think in some ways, less than the diner, less than even Twin Peaks, I think she sees in Dale Cooper the potential for something like a home or safe place to be, not necessarily in one location, but with this person. So that's kind of the appeal I get, I think, from Annie to Cooper and maybe vice versa of what they're seeing in each other at this stage.
That's actually a really good point, and I think that's a one thing to contrast with that scene. And I think it is the same scene because it's when they're dancing, and Mayor Milford, he's trying to get the mic to work. But like while they're having this conversation, I forget the line offhand, but Cooper refers to her a queen as in some capacity, and that's when it changes. And like you never saw the giant act like this before. He's not saying anything. He's like shaking like his hands. He's like shaking his head, like he's mouthing like no, like this is like insinuating that something really bad is going to happen. And of course, this is around the time when Wyndham Earl, he's shifted from the chess game to the queens of cards. I don't think, yeah, Annie's not on those. It's Audrey, Donna, Shelley, and then just Dale Cooper, just kind of as like I think he was on one of the cards. But yeah, Annie's not in at all. But the fact that he mentions Queen and the giant is coming out, I think this is another reason why a lot of people thought that there was either a Tulpa or a more insidious part of Annie. And again, I think that's the reason why I thought that for a while as well. Do you think of anything pertaining to the giant relative to this scene in particular?
I think this part's really interesting. And again, you can wave a lot of it away as just plot contrivance. But if you do choose to take this for face value, what does it say about Dale Cooper that he doesn't do anything differently? Like, my question becomes, does he see this too? Or does he not see this? I'm assuming he sees this based on the way that Kyle MacLachlan's responding. It looks like he is witnessing this event and processing it in some form that he should like remember and know it. At the same time, we do know that sometimes when it comes to the stuff with the rooms and with the lodges, that things can get a little bit weird with memory because he has that dream where he knows who killed Laura Palmer and the next day forgot about it. And it's the kind of thing you don't think you'd forget. So maybe, charitably, he hears this from the giant, experiences it, but as soon as the giant goes away and we return back to reality, he does not remember it anymore. It's like a fuzzy, faint little echo of a memory, just a feeling something's off, but he already forgot it as soon as it happened. Maybe. But if he didn't, right? If he actually remembers that the giant did this, and he already knows the whole queen thing is happening, like he's aware of this plot to some degree. He's trying to like stop it from happening. If I'm remembering correctly, he's aware of this queen idea. Then the fact that he doesn't seem to do anything either means to me, A, he doesn't know what to do at all. He has no idea. Or B, he's choosing not to do anything, which seems really dangerous, if not insidious. If he remembers what the giant said, if he understands what it means, and if he chooses to not act, even though he knows he could do more, this to me is one of the biggest mistakes of Dale Cooper's life. And I'm inclined to believe that that's the case because I think he saw it. I think he remembers it. I think he knows what it is. I think he's confident that it's just not going to happen. I think he's confident he can protect her. I think he's thinking, as long as I'm around, we're okay, which is an overconfidence that Wyndham Earl and the Lodge will exploit.
Actually, I'm glad you're bringing up Wyndham Earl because I think that's one thing that's worth mentioning. I forget when this falls. I think it's before the scene, but it's when Cooper's at the sheriff's station and he's there with Truman. And they clearly know about Wyndham Earl. And I guess put in perspective by this point, Wyndham Earl escaped during the Laura Palmer case. He actually he even put out his first chess move as they were closed in on the Laura Palmer murder. And they've been doing chess moves back and forth up until that point. Even though that was clearly Wyndham Earl was a concern for Cooper, he's looking out the window and he just can't stop thinking about Annie. And he's super energetic about it at a time when he should be vastly concerned for his well-being and the people around him. So I kind of wonder if there's just something about Annie. There's just this allure to her about, like what I was saying before, how Norma said that Annie's always in her own like sort of world, and that Cooper is kind of sees something into that, and that they're both very intuitive on that level. I don't know if it really excuses him for just like overlooking the Giants warning, like a warning that was like way more like, I guess, animated on the Giants' part, even compared to the death of Maddie. So again, it's not really the best explanation, but Cooper's always more fixated. He's the person he's most fixated on is always the woman he's currently with at that exact moment.
This is a great time to bring up during research, I was reading the article on 25 Years Later by Lindsay from Bickering Peaks. And the article is Who's Annie? And there's this part in here where she writes, quote, where once Cooper was beholden to his intuitive abilities when it came to cracking cases, now that skill disappears from his toolbox entirely, but only as long as Annie is nearby. In one rather pointed scene early in the relationship, Cooper meets Annie at the Double R and misses the fact that Wyndham Earle is sitting, facing him, across the bar. It's only when Annie gets back to work that Cooper picks up on this hint his subconscious certainly felt and looks in Earle's direction. Alas, he's already left the diner. So, a couple notes on that. First of all, it's interesting that you can read that then as either a purposeful indication that something is wrong, that the presence of Annie throws off Dale Cooper's intuition and reasoning abilities. Or you could take it to be rather that there is like a mistake potentially happening here in the writing or something, that it's kind of just a coincidence. It really depends on how much you want to read into this, that it could be the writing issue or a purposeful hint. And there's other things that in this article too that make it seem really strange about Annie. Again, pulling into the idea of like if there's something supernatural going on with her, that when she's kidnapped at the end of season 2, the two people who should be the most concerned about Annie other than Dale Cooper show zero reaction. Shelley is seen at the Double R with Bobby, repeating her conversation with Heidi like nothing had changed, not even really seeming to have any worry that her coworker, possibly even friend, is like gone. But more glaringly, because at least in that one, you can kind of, argue that there's a reason for that. It's not the right time and place for it to even get brought up as a topic. But more glaringly, only hours after Annie had been kidnapped, Norma is with Ed and Nadine. And this is where Lindsay writes, quote, she is more concerned with her romantic life than the safety of her innocent sister, who was abducted by a madman in front of Norma's eyes only hours before. It seems less like the actions of a concerned big sister and more like the actions of a woman who has no sister to worry about. Again, age-old question. Is it on purpose that Norma doesn't have a reaction, or is it just kind of the way it was written and really Norma should have had a reaction?
I know I've been saying this a lot during this episode, but this is another thing I have to put a pin in until we get to the season 2 finale, because I wrote down specifically about Norma and Ed's weird interaction, because I think there's something else that's going on with that scene. It's less of Norma not caring, or I guess not knowing in a flimsy manner, but I think there's an esoteric nature that's going on with that scene that's preventing her from being concerned about Annie. But for the time being, I think it's worth talking about is that it's the day of the Miss Twin Peaks contest. And I think, actually, this is one thing I should mention. I didn't write this down in my notes, but it's something that's bugged me on a couple rewatches. So it's the day of the Miss Twin Peaks contest. And there's this kind of playful energy with Norma, Shelley, Annie. Like, oh, who are you going to vote for? They're saying this to Norma. And Norma's saying something about how we need this to be like, we need to bring some joy, to this occasion because the town needs it. And Annie says, like, she's like, oh, you mean like Laura Palmer? But it just seemed like there's almost like an annoyance in Annie's voice. It's not a bad performance on Heather Graham's part. It's not really a bad direction on Tim Hunter's. I just thought it was kind of a weird thing for Annie to say, and the tone, at least that I took from it, seemed a little weird. Am I the only one that's kind of like thought this? Am I looking at it the wrong way? Is there anything you ever had about that? Because there's just something about the annoyance in Annie's voice that just seems really bizarre to me.
I honestly missed that. I think this is really interesting. When I was going through and taking my notes, I either missed that line of dialogue or didn't think about it too hard. So that's pretty interesting to me. Without having heard it myself, I guess it does raise more questions about this idea of the connection between Annie and Laura, Annie's relationship with trauma, collective and individual. Like, I think there may be something to glean into from it if you wanted to, but that is a very curious direction in terms of that voice line delivery that, again, I didn't even catch.
What I always thought was strange is that Tim Hunter, I think next to David Lynch, is probably one of the best directors of the original series. And I really like Heather Graham in this role. It's just that it seemed like there was just something weird about the delivery in my part. And again, maybe I'm just reading too far into it. But I remember on my first rewatch, it was something that bugged me. And on my last rewatch, it was something that stood out as well. But I think another thing on the topic of the esoteric nature of Annie is that when Dale and Annie are preparing for her speech, like she only has 6 hours to come up with the speech and she hasn't had a single word. he's gonna help her, but like lovemaking ensues with the two of them. And for me, this is the part that I think of when Major Briggs says fear and love open the doors, because obviously Cooper and Annie, they've developed this relationship in a short time, but also later on that night when she will be abducted, there's that fear of losing her. I think that more so than like the planets aligning or like the time of year, I think this is actually a thing that opens up the Red Room above all else. I think that's partially why Wyndham Earl was insistent on getting Miss Twin Peaks, and that he on some level knew that that was going to be the factor to get into the Red Room to begin with.
Well, it's also curious that like within this scene too, when she's asking for help about her speech, they quickly like go from talking about saving the forest to talking about their internal struggles. And she talks about how part of her forest has been damaged. She's tried to replant, but nothing's taken root. And then she says, every forest has its shadow, and I can see half my life's history in your face, and I'm not sure that I want to. What strikes me about that dialogue is that on one hand, it is like her talking and like being very open about her experiences and trusting him and talking about how like she sees so much of herself in him and like their future together. But hanging over that is the shadow, right? Is this idea that it's kind of ominous. She's not sure this is a good thing. So going back to the idea of fear and love open the doors, my brain started going to the idea like, between Dale Cooper and Annie in this scene and also in general, their relationship up to this point, as well as what's going to transpire soon, does one of them represent fear more and one represent love more? Is one more afraid? Is one more in love? Because I look at him and I'm kind of looking at Annie, and it's like, I usually like to think that Annie is a strong-willed person, like she says she is. But when she is put into these positions that force her to confront her anxieties, I sense that there are these reservations and concerns, that there is implicit in here a sense of doubt, right? I'm reminded vaguely of like that T.S. Eliot poem. I think it was The Hollow Men, but the idea like the shadow falling is where the doubt is, or where there's that uncertainty. And that's kind of the image that evokes here for me. And Dale Cooper, despite all of his talk that like, as long as you're with me, everything's going to be fine, there's got to be some part of him that like feels those moments when the giant is warning him. So I get back to this scene you're talking about when they're having the lovemaking scene, and also thinking in The Return about how lovemaking scenes can show fear and love with certain other characters and Dale Cooper analogs. And I'm thinking like, if we read anything into like, for example, the part 18, Diane, Cooper, Richard, Linda, however you want to verb that, and the mix of emotions that accompany that lovemaking. And I look back at Annie and Cooper, I feel like both of them had the love and fear, right?
That's exactly what I thought of. I thought those two both had it, and that like that was the key part of getting into the Red Room. But before we get too much further into that, we should probably talk about the actual Miss Twin Peaks event, because there's this wide variety. Like, we have Lucy dancing, we have Lana doing her own sort of dance. Of course, all the women of Miss Twin Peaks, they all do like a formal dance in of itself. Audrey does her speech. And then Annie, she does her speech. And the thing is that this isn't really a slam against like the writing or anything on that matter, but I just think it's like the least memorable part of all of the Miss Twin Peaks stuff. Because, like with Audrey, hers is like a very pro-environmental message. Lana, that's like some that's very alluring to all the people. Dick Tremaine and Mayor Milford, obviously, like being the key components to it. But I would say is that when Annie does give her speech, it is pertaining to the trees. And while Audrey's talking about like like the environment, I think there's some about the trees and how the trees are surrounding Twin Peaks. That's what springs to mind for me. That somehow wins people over. Actually, Dick Tremaine, who we oddly enough talked about the last time, I kind of wonder if that was like a factor of why he was so moved by Annie's speech, that he, even though it was rated with him that he had a little fling with Lana in the closet, that somehow Annie's sincerity won him over in the end. Is there anything we should talk about with Annie's speech before we really get into the more serious parts of Wyndham Earl and subsequently the Red Room?
Yeah, I hope I can articulate my feelings well enough, because I'm still forming a lot of my feelings even as we're talking right now. But when I look through the lens of Annie in Twin Peaks, this speech takes on more significance to me as a viewer, where at first I kind of think of it, oh, well, Annie doesn't really want to do Miss Twin Peaks that much. She's kind of just talked into it. And unlike Audrey, she doesn't really stand to gain as much by having this big environmental message. She's kind of just winging it, making something up at the 11th hour. And while it is spoken beautifully, people believe her. It's not really that important to her, this whole thing. She's never really been about all this. But then, like, as I'm looking at the wording here, I do feel like there's a bit of subtext here that this might be a very personal speech for her as well. Even if prior to this part, she's not talking about like Chief Seattle all the time. But this idea, she says that your dead are soon forgotten and never return. And she's quoting Chief Seattle. Our dead never forget the beautiful world that gave them being. When the last red man has vanished from this earth, these forests and shores will still hold their spirits. I think it's interesting, this idea of seeing and confronting the death and loss, but also framing it in the sense that, like, there's going to always linger on the beauty alongside it, that even when all else fades away, we're going to remember and cherish this beautiful world we're given. And that she advocates for getting back in touch with that sense of beauty, that part of themselves that they deny, and that she says dies every day. And I'm reading this now and I'm like, this is Annie talking to herself, right? This is Annie saying to herself at this juncture in her life, I can dwell and die and fade away and be nothingness and only the darkness, or I can choose to rekindle and revisit the part of myself that I deny and try to regenerate in some way. And as she puts it, to become mystic warriors who love the earth and try to save it. I think this is Annie kind of reestablishing what she wants to be as someone who previously didn't have a mission statement. If anything, had her mission statement taken away from her time and time again. So I find it to be powerful in the sense of Annie making her own declaration. And what resonates with other people is her earnestness, because she does believe it.
That's a great observation, because for me, I guess for me, I always kind of looked at the Miss Twin Peaks as almost like a spectacle, because I forget, isn't it Ben Horn that he's the one pushing it? It shouldn't just be a glorified bikini contest, but there should be something more. I think that just because, like, there's all these like crazy spectacle moments that they seem to overshadow the speeches. And actually, I would say this includes Audrey's as well. I always thought there was something about the way that the trees were mentioned that, once again, it's how I know I'm like a broken record saying this, but there's something about Norma, how she knew that Annie was always in her own world, and that like there's just a way that she could articulate and view the world that was different from other people. That's like the one thing I can think of that would like have her stand out. And like you said with Chief Seattle, about that Chief Seattle has this poignant message and that would resonate even with some like Dick Tremaine of all people. And like we said on the last episode we recorded, Dick Tremaine, not long after or before this, found out that he was not the father, and he just gladly walked away. So if she could change his heart, I think that says a lot about Annie's speech.
And to, I believe, repeat what I said in the Dick Tremaine episode, I think I said something along the lines that maybe why it resonated with Dick Tremaine is the authenticity of it, that this is someone passionately meaning what they say. And Dick Tremaine is someone who spends so much of his life trying to posture and trying to read other people's posturing, that I think the frankness and sincerity and urgency of it, he kind of even says that's what appealed to him in the speech. So I think it does make sense, weird as it is, that there's at least a part of Dick Tremaine that sees Annie and hears the speech and understands and accepts that this is someone trying to redefine who they are in a genuine, authentic way. And as someone else who struggles to identify himself in an authentic way and gloriously fails, I think Dick Tremaine kind of respects it, because he's also someone that's making up his identity as he goes along, albeit for very different reasons and very different circumstances.
But I think now we have to shift to actually a lot of the stuff we've been putting pins in throughout like this whole episode.
Finally,
they are all about to be unpinned, because the moment Annie wins, everything goes awry, and that's when Wyndham Earl, dressed as Margaret, kidnaps her, takes Pete Martell's blue truck. And this is like by the time she arrives to Glastonbury Grove, she looks like she's like genuinely scared to enter the circle of sycamore trees. Like she somehow knows that something is going to happen before she goes into them. Or even like before she gets out of the truck, she says to him, it's like, if if you're going to kill me, just get this over with. And I think there's a part of me that thinks that she knows what's going on. But before she enters those sycamore trees, I have to bring up something because she quotes a Bible verse. It's Psalms 141:7, and she says, "Our bones are scattered at the grave's mouth, as when one cutteth wood upon the earth. But my eyes are unto thee, O God the Lord. In thee is my trust. Leave not me. Keep me from the snares that have laid for me, and the gins of the workers of iniquity. Let the wicked fall into their own nets, whilst that I withal escape." And the crazy part is that her prayers actually work out, which is a very, I guess to me is like actually very surprising. You know, when she talks about the bones being scattered, it's talking about like a fate worse than death that she's about to have, and then she prays that like the wicked will fall into their own iniquities, which Wyndham Earl does. It's his hubris of being in the Red Room, thinking he has the same authority that Bob does, and it works against him. And of course, we'll have to talk about the caveat of when Annie escapes, but at the end of the day, she does escape. So that prayer, it works out in some capacity. Is there anything we should talk about with that in mind as we go into the Red Room?
The one aspect, I think you did a great job summarizing, and biblical scholars can come at us if we're interpreting things differently. But the thing that also stood out to me, in addition to what you were saying, is the asking for God to set her heart against wickedness, to not do anything evil herself. So it's not just like, I want the bad people to get punished for the bad things and save the good people. I think also in that prayer, at least how I was reading it, was this idea that if I am doing something wicked, set me against it. Like, set me against my own wickedness, help me turn from it. So not only is it, I hope karma happens to Wyndham Earl, but it's also, give me some guidance here because I do not want to slip up. And considering what Dale Cooper is about to go into the lodge, and I think most people would agree, he slips up somewhere. It's interesting that Annie at least has the foresight to be like, don't just defeat the wicked person, help me stay on the good path too, because I want to be clear and guided here. So I think it's like a pretty well-rounded request, that with the one caveat you are alluding to, that when she escapes, is it a clear-cut salvation here? I think every other aspect, yeah, it comes true and it is relevant to the moment. It's not just filler Bible verse.
I'm focused on the first part of it about the bones being scattered. And I think that for her, and the reason why I was bringing up the sycamore trees is that I think that, as we were saying before, is that she intuitively knows the woods, and she knows there's something bad within that circle of trees, because once she goes in, she screams as she goes in, but then she has like almost like this mind control trance. And it's like, it's very eerie about how stoic she looks and how she just like walks into the Red Room just like completely nonchalantly. It's actually one of those scenes that actually gets creepier on each rewatch because of the stark contrast of her personality. The other thing we have to talk about is that as she goes in the Red Room, it is around this time that Ed and Norma, they're back home, and this is when Doc Hayward is taking care of Mike Nelson and Nadine. And it's such like a weird vibe because Ed walks in by the fireplace. He snapped his fingers. Norma's smiling. And put aside the fact that Annie's been kidnapped, just this whole environment is just like, it's not the right environment to be doing that. I remember the scene bugged me for a certain period of time, but I think that there's something about fireplaces that are used in Twin Peaks and what they represent, especially when Lynch directs it. Because just in this episode alone, we have this scene where Ed and Norma, they're just like completely oblivious, or at least seemingly oblivious to the fate that Annie has. Also later on is that Doc Hayward, when he comes home and confronts Ben Horn, he like knocks him into the fireplace. And also to, I guess, to backpedal, for lack of a better term, in Fire Walk With Me, is when Leland, it's like after he sees the one-armed man, and he's fuming in front of the fireplace, and he's thinking about when he murdered Teresa Banks. I think there's some about fireplaces that it seems to cloud people's judgments in some ways. And I know that with Ed and Norma, it's a little bit different because they're just kind of being dismissive, but they're not really thinking about their general surroundings until Nadine comes back to her senses. I think there's some about the way fireplaces operate and who's around them and how that dictates their actions.
I think this is like one of the most fascinating aspects of like any kind of analysis of Twin Peaks, is that you take these like situations and ingredients and you can completely justify very different reactions to them, where Norma not seeming to react at all to Annie's disappearance could be A, bad writing, B, Annie was never really there. There's something going on with Annie. Or C, like you're saying, something's going on with Norma. Like, is the problem Annie, Norma, something else spiritual? Is it the writing? Any of those are valid and fair game. And I think if you're gonna try to like defend Annie being like a relatively like a normal human being that maybe is more spiritually attuned, but not a tulpa, actually her sister, actually real, and you want to also argue that like this is purposeful, then I think you gave a really good defense and argument there that it could be the influence of something through the fireplace, that something's going on in the air that is affecting people. We already know like people's arms are being paralyzed and possessed. It's like affecting physiologically their bodies. Something is like happening in this area beyond just the woods that is leaking in and affecting. We could theorize for hours about what's going on with Sarah Palmer and that voice that comes out of her mouth at the double R, you know. There's so many things that are affecting people who aren't even directly related to what's going on with Dale Cooper that I don't think it's hard to believe then that maybe there's a reason Norma isn't reacting is something to do with the effect it's having on her. I think that's a pretty interesting idea.
For anyone who may have not listened to my previous episodes, that it's not necessarily the fireplaces. It's more so that the fire, because when I think of fire in Twin Peaks, it's always something that's very dark. Like, for example, Leland, when he sees Bob when he's younger, he says, "Do you want to play with fire, little boy?" Laura says the same thing to James like a few weeks before she's murdered. There's just like the way fire is introduced throughout all of Twin Peaks that there's a darker nature and it can change people's characteristics in a variety of ways. I know there's going to be a lot to talk about with the Red Room, but I at least want to mention that with Ed and Norma because these are two of the, probably the most selfless people in all of Twin Peaks. So for the fact for them to be so dismissive of the situation at large, it's like very out of character for the two of them.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense why you had put the pin in there. I do want to, before we go into the Red Room, just look a little bit more at Wyndham Earle here, because I think it's interesting that when Wyndham Earle is driving Annie to Glastonbury Grove and he says his name, Annie repeats his name. At least the way I got it, it's like she never heard of the guy before. Like the tone I read into it is like, Wyndham Earle? Who? And that's interesting because if that's the intended tone or, the plausible tone, does that mean Cooper never warned her about this guy? Because that's baffling. Even before the whole giant shaking his hands thing, maybe you want to mention that there is a murder man who is connected to Dale Cooper and anyone close to him. Like maybe mention, by the way, last time I was involved with something romantically and it went bad, that was actually like the wife of this man who is probably going to go after anyone close to me, which would be you. Like, it's baffling if she doesn't know who he is. That would speak a lot to what Dale Cooper has and has not said, because I doubt Annie would have forgotten if it was said. Wyndham Earle's a very unusual name, and I think the circumstances she would recall. So either A, I'm reading into this too much, or B, Dale Cooper never told her.
No, I think you're onto something. This is a overtly charitable take, but I think that because Audrey, Donna, and Shelley, they're the ones that got the notes, and Wyndham Earle was within their immediate vicinities, that from a professional standpoint, he was concerned about their well-beings because, when they go to the sheriff's station and he talks about how they need to have like 12-hour check-ins every day. But also, I'm going to default back to an equally flimsy one, is that Dale Cooper's so like enamored by Annie. It's like, I guess kind of what you're saying is that he thought like things would be fine as long as they were together. And both of which are very naive, but at the same time, there is no real logical reason why Cooper couldn't have just told her at a certain point.
Yeah, two things on that. One, just to wrap that up with the whole Annie's effect on Cooper situation. There are a couple parts in season 2 where Harry will comment like, "Hey, Coop, I'm not really knowing your mind to wander, but you're really not focused on what's going on." And Cooper basically admits like, "Yeah, 1 minute my mind will be clear and focused, and then suddenly out of nowhere, he will see her or hear her voice." And he says he tries to reorient himself, but the image remains, and sometimes it makes him feel dizzy. He compares it to the symptoms of malaria, which at first it's like a little joke, like, oh, being in love, it's like a malaria, it's like a disease. But then his hand seizes up. Like the timing of it is like conflated there. So you get the situation where Harry is kind of calling Cooper out, like, you're not really on the ball right now, are you? And Cooper knows it's affecting him, but he's not really going to run away from it or change anything. And then as that conversation's happening, physically he's being like manipulated as he's talking about the psychological aspect. And to invoke John Justice Wheeler again, who's come up way more times than I would have thought in this episode, he's talking with Dale Cooper at the fireplace, and it's a good scene. It's a good scene. Like you said, some of the best John Justice Wheeler scenes are not with Audrey at all. And he's talking with Dale Cooper, and John Justice Wheeler says that love is hell. And Cooper then remarks that the Hindus say love is a ladder to heaven. And he goes on about how earthly love, it makes you feel more alive and it consumes you. It's like this strong, overwhelming force. And they both agree that while that is true, it makes you feel pain. And the way Dale Cooper words it is it says that it felt like someone had been taking a crowbar to his heart. And he says it's not too bad, though, because it's been maybe locked away too long. I think it's interesting here. One, he's acknowledging that, yeah, that's like this overwhelming, powerful force that is both heaven and hell at the same time, and painful and great. But then this phrasing of like someone taking a crowbar to his heart and unlocking it, obvious, easy reading is that it's Annie unlocking his heart with the way he feels about her. But if you want to read anything else into it, could someone else be opening that heart? Because if it's being dislodged right at the time that he's going to go into dislodge, to use a pun on words here, I think there's an argument that maybe something is at play here that is enhancing his feelings on Annie, because it's very convenient that at the exact moments that he needs to be on his guard before he gets into some really bad danger, that's when Annie steps in. That's when these feelings occur. And rather than thinking Annie's a tulpa, I more take the side that some other outside forces are manipulating kind of both of them. And that's what we see happen as well when Annie goes into Glastonbury Grove. She is taken over. So I think that she's a lure for Cooper. I think Wyndham Earle's a lure for Cooper. But I also think Cooper has been roped along too, because there are forces outside their control that are overpowering all three of them.
Oh, I totally agree. So before we get really into the Red Room and everything we see in the season 2 finale, is there anything we should keep in mind about Annie as Dale Cooper navigates the Red Room before those events?
Yeah, I just have two remaining odds and ends that didn't fit necessarily anywhere else in our notes or in my notes. And the first one is a poll from the Welcome to Twin Peaks Access Guide, because, of course, any opportunity I can get to find a way to make that book relevant, I will do so because it's very funny to me. But actually, though, this was something that when I first read the book was like super weird and ominous to me. And I can definitely chalk it up to just not thinking about it too hard. But there's a page 53, where it's talking about fishing lures. And I think it's like in Pete's tackle box or something. But they have all these different ones. One of them is called the Black Palmer, which that's an ominous name for a fishing lure if there ever was one in the context of Twin Peaks. But there is one just called Annie. There is a fishing lure called Annie. And here's the thing, right? The Welcome to Twin Peaks Access Guide, how seriously you take it, how canon it is. Most people, I don't think, even know this book exists. And if they do, they probably haven't read it. And if they've read it, it's funny. It's like a funny little joke book. There's a part in here where it talks about Ed eating so many, like, I think it's waffles, that if he actually ate them, it would probably kill him. But it just says, yeah, he did it. He broke the record. And it, like, they measure things heights in Big Ed's. Like the waterfall height is given in Big Ed's. So take all of this, however seriously you want. But I think it's very suspicious and very curious that in the midst of all these like lures is Annie, which I think is actually based on a real fishing lure, but it's the presence of it. And it gets me wondering about the idea, again, of Annie as a lure. So I'm not going to lie, when I think about Annie being used as a lure to lure Cooper into the lodge, I am 100% thinking of that part in the Access Guide when it mentioned Annie as a fishing lure. And we're going to catch that big fish, and that's Dale Cooper. And that's something I didn't find a place to mention prior, but I think it's fascinating.
I mean, I think it's kind of just like a funny thing to be up front, but at the same time, I think it's worth addressing that when Dale Cooper was talking about Annie and how she was like in his mind, like how he couldn't get his mind off her, his hand started to shake. And the thing is that there's also that old woman at the Double R Diner. Her hand shakes. We don't know much about her story, but Pete Martell, while he's waiting for, I can't believe we're bringing him up again, while he's waiting for Audrey and John Justice Wheeler, his hand starts to shake. And this all seems like it's pertained to Bob when he's like reaching out into the woods and those sycamore trees. But at the same time, there is like that weird tangential connection of Pete and Annie. And again, it's a very long stretch, but I think it's at least worth addressing. Anything else we should keep in mind, leading into the Red Room?
Last thing is that also in that article by Lindsay from Bickering Peaks, there's a comment on the article, like below it, where someone was talking. Their name is Jubel Brasseau, and I'm sure other people have noticed this or made a comment to it too. This is the one I came across, but questioning like the name Blackburn as a name convention, because a lot of times with characters in Twin Peaks, it is a play on words or it's a reference to like an actor or a famous film character or something on those regards. But Blackburn is interesting just because of what Annie is in the story. The idea of Blackburn, Black Lodge being mixed with the idea of burning, fire, scorched engine oil, perhaps. So even just her last name being Blackburn is incredibly ominous and ties in directly with where we're going to go into the Red Room now. That if you want to read into her name is Fishing Lure of the Black Lodge on Fire. Like, that's scary. That's really ominous.
And this is a little bit of a parallel with Annie and Laura, but I'm thinking like at the end of the final dossier, I know a lot of people, you and me included, we feel very strongly on this, but how basically Leland and Sarah, they represent the union of Judy and Bob, and how they would bring the Antichrist to the world. And I think that I kind of wonder if there's something almost like that with Annie, because, with the last name Blackburn and the odds are stacked against her, but there's that goodness in both of them that they kind of see throughout. And we'll get to it with Annie when we return to the final dossier, but I kind of wonder if like that could be read into as if like, that there was that there's something potentially insidious that she's stacked up against and that she's able to overcome.
No, that leads just to a whole fascinating tangent you could go on if someone wanted to try to theory craft connecting Annie to Sarah Palmer. I'm already like thinking of things you could say and do with that I'm not going to get into. I'll save that for someone else. But I think that leads to some fascinating comparisons, to be honest.
And I guess to get to arguably Annie proper in the Red Room is that Dale Cooper, he goes through his odyssey of sorts. And it's actually what the first time he sees Annie, it's right after Dale Cooper runs away from Laura's doppelganger. He walks in the hallway, walks the room, he's bleeding, walks back out into that hallway, back to the other room. And, you see the bloody footprints. And then he sees Caroline, who turns into Annie, who still has the dress and blood from the same spots. He yells out her name, and this strobe light reflects on the floor. And it seems like he re-enters and he talks to her. And this time she's back in her black dress. She talks as if she's Caroline because she's saying, like, Dale, I saw the face of the man who killed me, and, other things pertain to that night. She, quote unquote, turns into Caroline, turns back into Annie, and this time she's back in Caroline's dress, and then she turns into the screaming Laura doppelganger, and then Wyndham Earl. My theory behind this is that because Wyndham Earl, he's starting to get a little bit power hungry. I think that this is all an illusion by him. I mean, keep in mind, we're talking about Wyndham Earl, where it seemed like if we're going by his voice, he was the one talking through Sarah Palmer to Major Briggs saying, I'm the Black Lodge with Dale Cooper. And then it cuts to the room saying, I am waiting for you. So I think Wyndham Earl is actually taking a lot of control in the Red Room and is starting to seep out into the real world.
I completely agree. I will admit that prior to doing some research and notes on this, I probably would have looked at you confused, but I actually agree because if I remember correctly, when he initially, at the very beginning of all this, these steps you're mentioning, Cooper runs away from screaming Laura's doppelganger. Isn't that the part where like there's a brief flash of Wyndham Earl's face superimposed on screaming Laura?
There is, yeah.
So this is like very purposeful because there's no reason why we had to do that blink and you miss it quick little flash of Wyndham Earl, which, by the way, if someone didn't have the ability to pause or rewind and you're watching this on a CRTV back when this show aired in the 90s, you're going to miss that. Like, I don't know how many people would even register that even happened, but it feels significant based on like what you're saying, all these turns of events ultimately culminating in Wyndham Earl being the final turn of this character and having a different Annie start fading in and out. Yeah, I'm inclined to believe that Caroline, the Annie that Caroline was, the brief instance of the Laura doppelganger, I'm going to probably interpret, at least for the time being, that all of those were the trickery of Wyndham Earl.
And I think that the first time we see the real Annie, it's after this happens, Annie appears, she looks nervously at Wyndham for a moment before she disappears again. And I think it's worth mentioning where she is standing at this point, because it looks like she's standing kind of in front of the same altar that has the owl cave ring from the missing pieces. Do you think that there's a connection? Because while she's not wearing the ring at this point, I think that if we're looking at a retroactive perspective, that the Owl Cave ring is starting to become more of an important piece for her and for the Twin Peaks mythos at large.
I'll admit, prior to you asking me, I had not connected the pedestal ring placement idea. That is fascinating. I have so many questions. Obviously, everyone does, I suppose, about the Red Room. But I have so many questions because briefly going back and tying it back in, one thing that kind of interested me is that prior to going into the Red Room, when Wyndham Earle's like leading her to the destination at Glastonbury Grove, she says that he'll come for me, presumably talking about Cooper. And Wyndham Earle says he won't. But this is interesting because, like, I'm listening to this and I'm like, Wyndham Earle, okay, do you actually think Cooper is going to come for her? I've been assuming yes. Like, I've been assuming that you're banking on Cooper coming for Annie. Like, I've been assuming you need Cooper to come for Annie. But what's weird to me, like, upon reflection, is that he's able to enter through those curtains with just Annie. Like, did Wyndham Earle need Dale Cooper at all for his plan? Or is this actually not his expected result? Because he says, nope, he's not going to come for you. And then they go into the Red Room. But also, if you take in that Sarah Palmer line, like, it seems like he also is counting on Dale Cooper showing up. I start to question, like, what Wyndham Earle's, like, exact plan would be here, because we know at the end of the day he wants to be like a powerful wizard of darkness, like some D&D campaign gone amok. But I don't know what exactly he wants with Dale Cooper, other than the sweetest form of revenge, other than to just like get to stab the guy and take his soul. But let's say Dale Cooper didn't show up. Let's say Dale Cooper actually didn't show up. What would Wyndham Earle have done with just Annie? Would that have been enough because he got in, or does he need Dale Cooper's soul? Because, I mean, he knows Dale Cooper enough to know that he actually is going to. That's where this line just struck me as so interesting, is that he tells Annie, nope, he's not. But like everything about Dale Cooper's character that Wyndham Earle would know indicates the opposite.
The only two things I could think of offhand that I could feasibly counter with it, and I don't even know if they're really concrete, but he just wanted to say something to basically run Annie down to make her feel more hopeless. But I think it's also worth mentioning, because we did talk about before, and it's veering a little away from Annie, but because, in my opinion, she's the reason why he was able to get to the Red Room, he communicates through Sarah Palmer to Major Briggs that, like, he is waiting for Major Briggs. So it makes me wonder, like, what else Wyndham Earle wanted from Major Briggs after he, because obviously Wyndham Earle didn't plan that Leo Johnson would let Major Briggs free, but it makes me wonder what that rivalry, what they was trying to set up for, what the true motivation was. And in my opinion, Wyndham Earle, by the time he gets to Owl Cave, his characterization starts to change so much that behind the scenes is probably sloppy writing. But to me, I think that now that he's like getting close to the Red Room, his characterization is just changing, because the type of person he is and like the forces that he's working with are starting to like kind of compromise him. I know these aren't particularly concrete, but these are the things that are kind of run through through my mind at the moment.
The briefest thing I'll say about it is that I do feel like with Wyndham Earle, he is at this point in the lodge operating under the idea that he's in control of his faculties, but like this man is so far out of his element right now. He thinks he is going to become some like god of the spiritual world. He is like a pawn at best in a game far bigger than he is aware of. So there's always going to be this dubious nature that when Wyndham Earle is doing anything in the Red Room, how much of that is him and how much is that him being puppeted? Because when you mentioned earlier the idea of like Bob stretching out the hand and the shaking hands or whatever, you could read that as the idea of like pulling puppet strings, that there is this sense in which greater forces like Bob are manipulating the people of Twin Peaks, Wyndham Earle very much included. And where this bears reference with Annie is all of this stuff we're talking about where he's like messing with Dale Cooper, Annie's manifesting in different ways. How much of that is Wyndham Earle and how much of that is Bob is not really clear. What I think is clear is what happens next, where you have Wyndham Earle's soul get taken and he's like completely powerless and lets out that just odd, like, I think it's like a scream or whatever. Like you could just sense when like the fire comes out of his head. This is a shell of a man. There's nothing left of him at this point. So I think regardless of where he's at now in that spectrum, whoever is doing this, what strikes me as interesting is that when Wyndham Earle appears is at the point where Cooper flinches. It's when he shows that knee-jerk reaction of fear. That's when Wyndham Earle manifests for the whole idea of I'll take your soul in exchange for letting Annie live.
One thing that's worth mentioning, and this is pertain to how Dale Cooper is around when he's like head over heels for a woman. When Dale Cooper, not when Dale, when Wyndham Earl emerges, he says, "I'll let Annie live if I can take your soul." And not even a second's hesitation, Dale Cooper says, "I agree." And so Wyndham Earl takes the soul, but then it reverses because Bob is now taken over. And of course, Wyndham Earl's like mortified by this. And Bob says, "Be quiet." In theory, lets Dale Cooper go, but as we'll see in a few seconds, not really. But he does take Wyndham Earl's soul. Cooper's doppelganger emerges. He gets out of the red room, and then Annie comes out as well. But I think this is an interesting transition from the season 2 finale to the missing pieces. Is that when Harry Truman he sees Cooper and Annie out of Glastonbury Grove, she's wearing her black wardrobe, but when she's taken to the hospital, the missing pieces, she's wearing Caroline's outfit. The blood seems like it's all the same, like relatively speaking, but the outfits are different. I was thinking about this quite a bit last night, but what do you think of like this in terms of it? Oh, actually, I should also mention is that not only are the outfits different, but in the missing pieces, it says some months later after the events of Fire Walk with Me, which can't be possible. It can only be a month at most. So I know there's a lot to unravel there. I've thought about it, but I want to hear what you think of it first.
I hope you have some good thoughts to balance out my not so great ones. I look at this and I'm curious because it goes back to that idea that I generally don't agree with, of the idea of her being like a tulpa or something, where various forms of Annie are not real, or whatever one came out of the lodge might be the real one or the not real one. And I previously hadn't really, regarded that with a lot of agreement or conviction. But there is something to be said that if she's coming out of the lodge wearing the Caroline dress, which is not the one that she entered with, that would indicate possibly the idea that something else left that wasn't the one that came in. But then you've got that idea that she's able to voice that the good Dale is in the lodge. You get this verbiage of good and bad, which is this the bad Annie? Not necessarily. What is this Annie? What is the Annie that came out of there? And ultimately, I don't know if I have an answer. And I feel like I don't know what's sadder as an ultimate fate to Annie. If the real Annie left the lodge and everything that happens from this point is the same person we've been following this whole time, we have to contend with her sad fate at the end of the final dossier. If, however, what came out of the lodge and is present in the scene you're talking about wearing the Caroline dress is not the same Annie and is something else entirely, something that came from the lodge wearing Caroline's dress, then the real Annie never left, in which case she is stuck in the red room physically. Is that better or worse? And seeing as we really don't see her in any other capacity, all we really have is what the final dossier mentions. It leaves that dubious point of, is that the fate of Annie, or is that the fate of something else that's masquerading as Annie years later? I don't know.
So actually, one thing I should mention is that at the beginning of the missing pieces, it says some months later, and there's that instantly I'm like, no, that's not right. And I behind the scenes, I could concede that David Lynch, he doesn't care about continuity at certain points when he's making anything like this. But I was starting to think that if we're going by the final dossier ending, that there's two realities: one where Laura was killed, the other where she went missing. I'm starting to wonder if this is like Annie, that she got out of a different reality of sorts. Because like for me, I'm trying to think of like why she'd be wearing like a different outfit. And the thing is that when she's taken into the hospital, they say how Harry Truman found her, and she goes in, and actually she is wearing the ring, and no less. And she says that my name is Annie. I've been with Dale and Laura, the good Dales in the lodge. Write it in your diary. The nurse B Roundtree, she like waves her hand to make sure if she's actually cognitive or not. Finds out she isn't. Takes the ring from Annie, puts it on, looks at a reflection of a mirror, which I think is very important because the way reflections are used in when Lynch makes something, it's something very insidious. So she leaves, and we're left with the last scene in chronological order at this point is Annie in a mirror. So I think that's a lot of that is setting up the more insidious parts. But to come back to what I was saying before is that I'm kind of wondering if this is indeed a reality where Laura's just missing. I don't know why Annie would be in the red room to begin with, but I'm starting to think that maybe like she just got out. Like, no, there's just a different reality that with Annie being omnipresent, that maybe she's occupying two realities at once.
The conclusion is something weird is going on. That's the conclusion we reach. I think it's also, if you want to, like, I don't know if people want to read into times and numerology, the way the scene begins with B. Roundtree is a close-up on a clock at the time of 2:30. You want to do something with the time 2:30, you absolutely can. I don't got anything, but there's a lot of emphasis on specific numbers with David Lynch and clocks in general with The Return. So there's also that.
Before we cycle back, I actually Josh Eisenstadt from my Agent Desmond episode, I was talking to him a couple months ago, and he doesn't have an answer for it, but he noticed that 2:30 not only is that the time when Annie gets the ring taken from her, but that happens to be the time when James and Laura see each other in high school early on in the movie. And I don't know the connection at all, but the fact that Josh even found that observation is absolutely mind-blowing to me. But I guess to cycle back, because I was saying about how Annie, that like their things are omnipresent now, but coming back to the Red Room, Dale Cooper, he's worried about Annie, and he says this to the arm, and he asks, "Where's the ring?" And the arm says, "Someone else has it now." And for a long time, I actually thought he was referring to Annie having the ring. But looking at the continuity, I think that now that B. Roundtree has it, that means it's going to be going into the quote unquote right hands, presumably Mr. C. But I'm starting to think that there's got to be something about like Annie occupying two realities at once. And maybe, like, as we get to the final dossier, why there's this dormant nature to her, why the reality that we see her in is just why she's like so dormant. Is there anything we should talk about, as we're departing from the missing pieces and we're returning to primarily the final dossier?
I feel like at this point, now that we've been talking about Annie probably cumulatively longer than all of her screen time combined, we're getting to a stage where I'm hoping we still have enough room to like move and breathe with all the elephants in the room, because it feels like every single thing is like having like a bunch of asterisks and what if, and if you think this, because even when we're talking about the missing pieces, these are deleted scenes, right? Like the credits are like, when you watch it, or just say like Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, deleted scenes is how the credits open up, at least when I was watching on Criterion. And it's like, I don't know how seriously and canonically to take the missing pieces in general, and all of them, like there's rarely a contradiction, but a lot of what we're saying hinges upon how Annie is dressed in a deleted scene, and that did not get any continuity. I don't think B. Roundtree is mentioned in the Secret History Final Dossier Return. So like, in David Lynch's head, does he even remember that B. Roundtree is a person? Does he even like, was that even a part of the plot line? I feel like, again, speaking of elephants in the room, you got to acknowledge like things would probably look a lot differently if Twin Peaks had returned more in the 90s. If there was a season 3 in the 90s or another movie, I 100% think there'd be more follow through with Annie. Because the last thing I want to bring up before moving on to the post season 2 remaining stuff is that it's noteworthy and has to be brought up that the last words of the original series are "How's Annie?" And it's interesting because I've always found it to be chilling, incredibly effective. I love the final shots of season 2, but Annie is not by any account like one of the most prominent, memorable, liked characters. Even at the time this came out, she was important to Dale Cooper, but that's the final thought that the thing ends on. And I think about that in comparison to like season 1 ending, I think ended with Dale Cooper getting like shot by the unknown assailant, I think is the final moment. Don't quote me on that. And then the return ending with like, what year is it? Lights go out, all the momentous elements of that. Other than unraveling the fate of Cooper with the "How's Annie" line, I think it's fascinating that Twin Peaks very much could have ended, and for many years did end, on this ominous note of the fate of Annie Blackburn, a relatively new character. And I try to like read into like why. And the best I could come up with as far as a headcanon here is that in many ways, Twin Peaks started with the central mystery of Laura Palmer, of who killed Laura Palmer. And then poetically, the show ends with another mystery about another young woman, what happened to Annie. So it feels to me like a setup for another story. It feels to me like we're going to go in and find out how Annie is. But when the return eventually comes around decades later, it ain't answering "How's Annie?" Annie is mentioned one time, like in part 7, pretty much, and that's it. And we've already talked about that a little bit, that she's not a factor in the return. And my gut impulse is that if Twin Peaks had continued sooner, I think how's Annie would have actually been a pretty important question. And I think what happened is over the passage of time, Annie's relevance and importance for both David Lynch and Mark Frost, it diminished over time. Mark Frost gave her attention in the final dossier, but I don't think David Lynch was really that interested in returning to the character. That's the conclusion I've personally reached. I just think that when you look at the situation, there is, to me, inside a sadness that the mystery of who killed Laura Palmer is defining for the show and is really important, and we're going to continue to examine it. But the mystery of how's Annie is just this permanent ellipses. It's this permanent question that will never be answered, not necessarily because there's no answer, but because it feels like the emphasis and writing and the moment in time passed, at least as far as the televised aspects of Twin Peaks, that Annie and her mysteries and secrets got overshadowed again. That Annie, for a moment in time, was the main important figure, but then we're back to Laura being the central mystery when we actually get back to Twin Peaks. There's a moment in time in which I think what happened to Annie would have mattered more, and it didn't.
Me and Josh Eisenstadt, same conversation. We were actually talking about like had Fire Walk with Me been like enough of a success to warrant a sequel, that those scenes, the some months later up until the ending, would have been the opening to this hypothetical sequel. And I think around that time, Lynch and Frost would have actually really divulged and expanded much further onto Annie's character. But I feel like, coming into the return, that like 25 years later, that they probably felt like they couldn't do much with that character relative to what they wrote. So they felt it was best to write her out. But that's a good enough segue to go into it, is that with the final dossier, it is said that she spent one day in the hospital, mostly unaffected, and had no memories of going into the Red Room. But she went catatonic and unresponsive the next day. And this lasted for 10 full days. Now, 10 is like a very important number in the return, indicating the number of completion. Do you think that there's a correlation to her being unresponsive for these 10 full days, or do you think this is something that just retroactively fits in?
Well, retroactively is a curious word here because it really depends if Mark Frost reads the same meaning out of the number 10 that David Lynch does. Or did Mark Frost and David Lynch, when this part was being written, did Mark ask David Lynch how many days Annie should be catatonic? I don't think David Lynch would have necessarily had an interest or care, because at the end of the day, I think if David Lynch was interested in the story of Annie Blackburn, it would have been in the return. I whether Heather Graham appeared or not, I think we would have had more of it if David Lynch thought it was important for the story he wanted to tell. So my reading is this is probably entirely Mark Frost's decision, and I don't know how much Mark Frost reads into the number 10 or how much he cares about how much David Lynch reads into the number 10. So not only do I not know what the number 10 means to David Lynch, I don't know how much Mark Frost is paying attention to that.
No, that's fair enough. But I do think that there is a significance of her becoming this. I don't think this really reaffirms or debunks like what I was saying before about like Annie potentially occupying two different realities. But I think the most important part is to say for now is that Norma and or Shelley were at Annie's side the whole time. And she seemed to be getting mildly better, or to the point where she could even stand up and walk around. And nurses had to help her with everything else. And then Norma took her home like 2 months later. Things for a year were kind of normal, but is there anything we should keep in mind now that Annie's home and relatively safe?
The main thing I'll just add is to not be revealing myself as too much of a hypocrite here. I mentioned what David Lynch and Mark Frost intended with the number 10. At the end of the day, if the individual reader finds meaning out of that and they can do something with it that uses the tools of the show, headcanon is the way, I also would argue. So I don't read much into the numerology side of things, but I sure as heck know that a lot of other Twin Peaks fans do. And what you're saying about the number of completion seems to hold some pretty good weight, considering where we're going next, as far as Annie suddenly acting in a way that would seem unusual, but might be more explainable if, like you said, she's occupying two places. Something isn't right with her existence. There's like a push and pull happening.
Usually I don't get into the realm of meta whenever I speculate on these things, but I will say is that in the return in part 10, that is when Margaret says Laura is the one. And I believe she also asked in that same conversation, the Hawk, of what will happen when it's something about like the lights going out and the electricity. And she doesn't know. And that seems to pertain to the events of part 18 as well. So we're kind of getting this thing that it's showing that like how important Laura is and the ambiguity of everything after the return. How much Annie fits into it, I couldn't really say for sure, but that's the closest connection I can get to offhand outside of being the number of completion. But unfortunately, I've been delaying because we get another like severe trauma for Annie because a year after her abduction, Annie slashed her wrist with shattered glass, and Norma found her, took her to the hospital. And the thing is that Annie had no recollection of this and said, "I'm fine" at 8:38 a.m. the next day, with doctors effectively dismissing it as an auditory hallucination. Now, I think that you and me, and also actually the unplugged professor, when you're still doing the logcast, we all came to the conclusion that she's responding to "How's Annie" when Mr. C says it in the finale. It's like I was saying before, is that Annie has that otherworldly and now, in my opinion, that omnipresent quality. That's the only thing I could feasibly come up with it. But did you have any thoughts on all this like trauma and like her responses?
Yeah, to try to summarize, I guess a lot of those feelings is it goes back to the elephants in the room and all the what ifs. If this is the same Annie from the beginning in the childhood, growing up at the motel and experiencing all that trauma and all those things happening, if this is the same person, her life is just endless, endless, endless misery here. And the brief little bit of light we get is actually the stuff in season 2 with Dale Cooper and what she has with Norma. And it's just this overwhelming sadness. If this isn't Annie and this is some apparition that's been existing either as part of Annie or another dimension of Annie or some sort of spirit, then it begs the question of what even happened to the original Annie. And it might not even be necessarily that one's real and one's fake. It could be fragments of the psyche, right? It could be that Annie went in and she got fragmented in a way that what came out is her, but isn't all of her. And that's maybe the way that I'd probably reach, is to, I guess, make a very strange comparison, is if you're familiar with the video game Undertale, of all things, there's a character in the game that's like only seen through rare circumstances named Gaster. And there's a phrasing that's used that basically through his meddling with scientific discoveries, he fractured his existence in such a way where basically he got spread throughout time and space and basically only exists as a glitch in the game. He is a freak chance oddity that only shows up in very specific ways of playing the game at specific times through things you can't control. And the reason I bring that up is it almost reminds me of what Annie's become at this point, a glitch. This sort of like fractured existence that is not quite the whole picture anymore, just aspects of that picture. And again, that also adds another element of sadness to her fate of what's happened to her. Going back to the assumption, yes, I definitely still am on the train that "I'm fine" is an answer to "How's Annie?" And in that way, Mark Frost has answered the question. But in answering it, it's only really as a footnote in a grander mystery, rather than what might have initially been the genesis of a whole new story for a potential season 3 in the 90s. It's now just like a thing we're answering almost out of obligation, which I'm glad there was some resolution in some way, but then also I'm so conflicted on what this means for a character that I felt for. And I end up kind of in this mess of glad to have something, but wish it wasn't so sad. But is it fitting? Maybe. I don't know. I want justice for her. Like, there's a part of me that wants Annie to have a happy ending, even though I know this is not the series where that happens. Even though I know that most people probably don't have happy endings when all is said and done in this show and in real life. I don't know why I would expect that to necessarily happen. But it's strange. And then, of course, you have the aspect added on top that it's described that even though she's in this catatonic state, her eyes seem alive, like there's an internal mysterious life happening. And it says that she hasn't aged. Like, she looks like she hasn't aged a day in 25 years, which is, again, another element to the idea that she is like a glitched existence, not the same human being that went into that lodge, meaning that effectively Annie died the day she went into that lodge. The moment she got possessed at Glastonbury Grove, that is the end of Annie Blackburn as a person. And what is now left is some fractured existence. And I don't know what to do with that.
On the topic of Annie hardly, if at all, aging, I actually thought this was like almost like a meta thing from Mark Frost, because I'm thinking of like when Mark Frost wrote the Donna Hayward segment in the Final Dossier. it seemed like the way that Donna was written throughout the 90s was at least partially modeled after Laura Flynn Boyle's career in the 90s. And I kind of thought that because Heather Graham, I mean, you look at her like now in the last like at least 25 years, 15, 25 years, she looks great. Like, I got to meet her like a week ago at the time of recording, and it's astounding that someone who's like in their mid 50s looks like they could get away with being in their late 30s. But I guess to cycle back though, is that weeks after Annie tried to end her life again, there was a community fundraiser for her, which Ben Horn actually donated the most money for. And this all helped get her to a private psychiatric hospital in Spokane. And she's stayed there the whole time since. The last thing I have, though, is that Tammy spent 2 hours with her. This is where she says that she's hardly, if at all, aged. And every year, once a year, she says, "I'm fine" at 8:38 a.m. And unfortunately, there's not really much we can talk about with Annie after this, because that means for at least like nearly 25 years that she's been very dormant. Is there anything we should keep in mind about Annie now that we're winding down?
I actually have a few more angles to speak about, I suppose, about Annie that I've been holding a couple cards back this time. So this is what Harley Payton said, quote, "The speculation about Annie is interesting, but again, incorrect. Sad to say, Annie was, at least when the character was initially conceived, a damsel in distress, and not a great deal more than that. However, had the show continued, we might have deepened her connections /past/significance, etc. And she might well have become an agent from the White Lodge. It's a very good idea. But as it stood, and given that we never had that third season to continue, she was out of neither the Black nor the White Lodge." And I found that cited by Joel Bacco in his character analysis on Annie. And I bring this up at this juncture to kind of mention again that when we're talking about all the complications with Annie's character, it's that even one of the main sources on the writing team, one of the main involvements behind the scenes, even said that like Annie was just meant to be a woman that Dale Cooper would fall in love with and then save. So the fact that there is so much to potentially talk about with this character is kind of an interesting byproduct of just a mixture of circumstances and what retroactively has happened since that reinterprets the character. That I think for me, I'm at the stage that I don't think there's a lot necessarily of meaning in Annie's character until the viewer and audience come into the character and really bring their own to it. So it's with that in mind, I do at least want to talk a little bit about why I like Annie Blackburn as a character, because when I first watched Twin Peaks, I did enjoy her character, and it's one that resonated with me a little bit. And going back to her character now still does. And in the midst of talking about all these like writing issues and ultimately my frustration that it feels like she really was just a character written to be a damsel in distress and another female victim character, I do think there's something that people can connect to and relate to because I fall into that category. So I'll preface this by bringing up again that article by Lindsay from Bickering Peaks. And I want to bring it up because I think it leads to maybe the most concretely I can explain my point of view. So there's this part where she writes, "The evidence of Annie's oddness adds up quickly. From missing basic social cues to being largely ignored by the town around her, a place in which she grew up and where her sister runs a popular business, she is marked off as distinctly other from the start." And then later, Lindsay writes, "But the level of weird that she presents goes beyond what anyone might expect. Chief among them are her conversational skills, which seem very stilted at first, growing increasingly fractured as the series continues with her arc. During a memorable scene in the diner, Cooper and Annie discuss philosophy in their budding relationship, with the conversation seeming more like a series of platitudes spoken at one another instead of dialogue between would-be lovers. At the Miss Twin Peaks opening night dance later that evening, Annie gives another speech to Cooper. She doesn't even face him, but instead angles her body to the side, speaking past him, eyes laser focused away from him as she talks about him, around him, but not to him. Both of these speeches feel rehearsed, almost scripted, as if they were reading lines written for her by someone else." End quote. And I bring that all up because this is in an article where Lindsay is mostly, from my memory, talking about how Annie feels to be a character that's so strange and otherworldly that she might not be what she first appears on first blush, that there might be some supernatural aspect to her. But when I hear all of that, when I think of Annie, to me, that reads as autism. And I wanted to bring this up through the example because I think, without necessarily intending it, exactly what Lindsay's describing there is how I connect to Annie's character. So just a little bit about myself. I found out about, I want to say it was like over a year now, year and a half, I'll say, I found out that I am autistic and I got diagnosed. And prior to that, I connected with Annie's character among a few other characters in fiction, but would not have really been able to pinpoint why. But it's these traits here, because the idea of an outsider who has trouble with social skills, has stilted speech, prefers to have deep conversations about philosophy rather than small talk, doesn't make consistent eye contact, and sometimes talks like she's rehearsed the conversation in her head in advance. Those are relatable experiences to autistic people, or at least many autistic people. And so as someone who's gone through those kind of things, it's so interesting seeing some people interpret Annie as so strange that she might not be human. And over here, I'm looking at her like, oh, that's relatable. And it's like this kind of conflicted and like brought me to a more thinking about the character that there's this conflict, I think, in some of David Lynch's work that I'm calling disability and the divine. And I've noticed, and again, it's not really a subtle thing, that David Lynch oftentimes uses people with disabilities as some sort of conduit for the divine and for the spiritual. Most obviously in physical attributions, someone who is very short or very tall or is an amputee, those are going to usually be conduits. But even people like Harold, who has his like paranoias and fears, that also gives him some sort of connection in a sense. And you've got not just the physical amputee aspect, but Philip Gerard has like schizophrenia, and there's the haloperidol stuff. So what's weird to me is, whether intentionally or not, and probably unintentionally, I feel like Annie became a character who is simultaneously autism coded, again, probably not on purpose, and also supernatural coded in a way that fits in line with other David Lynch and Twin Peaks characters having some form of disability, physical or mental, that gives them a spiritual inclination. And I don't think, for the record, that David Lynch or other writers are doing this with bad intentions intentionally. I think it unintentionally can have the effect of othering. If everyone who shows up in a David Lynch work or Twin Peaks that is somehow disabled or different has to be a spiritual element, that's where I think it kind of risks making it seem like disabled people don't just exist as people. They can't just live lives. And I think that's why I feel that like inner instinct to want Annie to be human and to be a person, because I want her existence to be seen as, you know, a normal thing that can happen. And at the same time, again, I don't begrudge anyone who does view her as a tulpa, because there's so much suspicious stuff going on with her that I just look at the whole situation and it's fascinating to me. Two other parts that I took from episode 26 that kind of show the potential autism coding. There's that part where she says she feels disoriented, like she knows where she is, but it feels odd being here. And there's that whole conversation where she says, I'm okay. And then she says, well, you asked me how I am. I'm not really supposed to say how I am. I'm supposed to say, I'm fine, thanks. How are you? Like this whole idea of like, I know when I talk to people, I'm not supposed to actually say what I'm thinking because that's too much information. It weirds people out. So I'm just going to give them the short small talk version. And the fact that she like has to acknowledge that out loud as like a thing, that feels like someone who has difficulty with those implicit social cues. And also there's the tie into the I'm fine, thanks, how are you, with the how's Annie, I'm fine. That's a whole other angle you could look at it. And then in that same episode, I think it's that same conversation, she asks him if he thinks she's strange. And she adds that, you know, due to social niceties, even if you did think I'm strange, you wouldn't tell me. And Dale says he would. And so as someone, again, who can relate on the autism spectrum side of things, I find that to be an appealing aspect of like friends and other people, if I trust that they would actually tell me what they think, that I don't have to like read between the lines, because I'm bad at reading between the lines. And so I look at Annie and I don't even know, again, if it was meant to be this way, but she is so clearly to me an analog for the autistic experience of going through the world feeling like a stranger, of feeling like you're an outsider and everyone else gets something you don't. So when she has all these experiences of like going to the convent or trying to run away, having a hard time trusting people, that's another layer and component that hits for me. And again, regarding her aspects of the divine, a lot of it, we talked about it, but I do also want to mention that when she first appears in episode 24, she enters and walks across Major Briggs, who is obviously also spiritually inclined. And later in that same scene, Mr. Briggs talks to Margaret Lannerman, who also is the other like spiritual inclined person. And you mentioned before the symbol recognition from Annie, that this idea of the disabled and the divine, I think, fits Annie as well and contributes to some of my feelings on her. So to segue a bit, I guess I'm curious for you personally, when you watch Twin Peaks, what do you think of Annie as a character just on an emotional level or a personal level, beyond what she represents and means? Is she a character that you found yourself connecting with, or do you find her to be someone that's not necessarily believable as a person?
No, I think she's believable. I think that when you talk about the like when she talks about like the social niceties, or when she says how she's doing the double R, but then she elaborates that, like the more conventional aspects of conversation, that does feel like it taps into it. But I think to go with people who are on the spectrum and go with the pilot alone on this one, I think that definitely Lucy and even Cooper kind of fit the bill for that. One of which is very spiritually inclined. Then Lucy, it's debatable, but I never thought of her as being as intuitive as, say, Cooper or anyone like that. But you have someone like Cooper, where when he first meets Sheriff Truman, he's very down to business, but then he has to ask about what kind of trees are surrounding Twin Peaks, and he says Douglas firs with such enthusiasm, and then he cuts back to ask about the coroner's report, or actually Lucy's first scene when she says that Pete's on the phone for Sheriff Truman, and she's being very oddly specific about which phone it is and which one to go to. I'm not sure like who it is. If it's, I would guess it's Lynch over Frost, but that there's characters that if they're not explicitly on the spectrum, that it at least seems like you can interpret and read it as such.
Yeah, there's some neurodivergence potentially there. And I always want to be careful because, sometimes people read this kind of conversation as trying to force characters to fit into this mold. And it's really not that at all. I just think that when you're looking at a character, even if it was unintentional, there's a sense in which you might connect to them on some level that's a bit deeper. And it's not that I'm saying Annie is autistic. I'm saying that she's relatable to me as an autistic person. And I think there's a difference between those things. The last thing that I had in my notes, which if I'm not careful, could be a whole can of worms. So I'll leave a lot of it for your discussion when you talk about Dale Cooper elsewhere. But regarding her relationship with Dale Cooper, the other aspect, potentially more sinister, goes back to that idea of Dale Cooper as the White Knight. And I bring this up because in the dossier, Tammy is describing that after Caroline's murder, Cooper truly suffered. He felt this deep remorse. He went to counseling, self-reflection, and she writes, quote, "He's on the record, well, tape anyway, confirming that this experience represented the most difficult lesson of his life, and admirably, he took it to heart. But that's not quite the same thing as entirely purging an ingrained impulse to save a troubled woman from herself. Is it, Chief?" And then in parenthesis, "Am I being too harsh on Agent Cooper here? I'm open to suggestions, so please let me know if you feel that's the case. Notwithstanding its importance, I believe Cooper's obsession with the Laura Palmer case harbors echoes of this tendency." And then later, quote, "Was this established trait a factor in Cooper's attraction to Annie Blackburn? It's possible that what drew him to Annie was something much purer and simpler. The fact that they both endured and survived vicious assaults by dangerous criminals against the core of their being, which nearly cost them their lives. That's such a powerful personal narrative and connection shouldn't be minimized. For all we know, had their relationship been given a chance to grow, it could have become the most healing bond that either of them have ever experienced. Possibly even, heartbreaking thought, the love of a lifetime. It's not outside the question, and I know it must be the least of what you would have wished for your friend. Sadly, we'll never know." So I think it's interesting that Mark Frost through Tammy invokes these two ideas where it's like, maybe Dale Cooper has a bit of a problem here, where he tries to save women from themselves and also save women from the world. And that gets him into some really bad situations. And that might be connected to what he saw in Annie, who, again, may I remind you, he consistently refers to as like a child. He says, "I'd love to see things through your eyes," as though it's like a new experience. He says that her responses are as pure as a child's. He hasn't felt any way about this about a woman since Caroline. And it's like we're drawing these comparisons where it's like he seems to almost have a bit of a parental almost aspect where he wants to lead Annie, follow me, what I'm going to do. And Annie seems to invoke more of an egalitarian, equal sort of relationship. The fact that one of the first things Dale Cooper notices about her is her scars on her wrist and then proceeds with that relationship. He is, on some level, consciously or unconsciously, knowing this is someone who has experienced difficulty and trouble. And so it does beg the question, how much of Dale Cooper's interest in her may stem from the fact that he sees her as someone who is vulnerable, and not necessarily that he has sinister intents, but that he is drawn to saving these kinds of people. And at the same time, when Mark Frost alludes to that idea, and Tammy alludes to that idea, also backpedaling, be like, well, okay, but maybe it's actually nicer than that. Maybe they actually connect in a good way. Maybe if they had been allowed to grow, maybe they actually would have had a beautiful relationship, and we'll never know. And so that's kind of the last thing I had in my notes, is that uncertainty that if Annie and Cooper would have been able to remain together, I see two different possibilities. One is that maybe as Annie saw more of the world, sure, she would lose that innocent naivety, but maybe Cooper would have actually loved to be able to spend time with her and learn with her and grow with her, that maybe they could have sparked and rekindled each other's inner worlds with their new ideas and new experiences. And I wrote, would it never get old? Would every day be like its own little gifted present? Like, I'd like to believe that they could have actually grown together as people. But there is that side that's always going to exist in the background, a shadow of a doubt. Is he only interested in living through her vicariously, like she's some sort of manic pixie convent girl? And that's also the question of getting to the heart of Dale Cooper, less than Annie. What did he want out of this, really? Because I think Annie's answer might be a bit simpler. I think she wanted someone safe. I think she wanted someone that she could trust.
Yeah, I would agree. And I will say is that this might be a bit of a cynical take on if the relationship would have worked or not. I would say no. And I don't think it's even partially, I don't think it even has to do with his, like, white knight syndrome, as Tammy puts it. But I always viewed it as that if we're going back to My Life, My Tapes, and you believe the early segments, that, his mother was gifted with visions. And I interpret it as that, like, she saw Bob and that he was, like, coming through in some capacity. And then when she died, and then it seemed like, there's all these subsequent deaths throughout his life, like romantic interests, family, not being able to see his brother ever again. That there's like all these things that were out of his control. And now that he's in the FBI, he wants to do these things to help people. But, case in point, Caroline, she dies while he's supposed to protect her. And then Annie comes in the picture, and then she suffers a horrible fate. And like we were saying before, is that he could have and probably should have told her about Wyndham Earl, just even as a passing sort of thing. But then when he comes out of the Red Room, he has Janie E. And I was mentioned before how, it's for as critical as I can be on Del Cooper, I think he does care about these women, especially in the moment, because he gave up his soul to let Annie live to Wyndham Earl. And then when you look at the return, the moment that Dale Cooper, the traditional Dale Cooper, wakes up in part 16, without a second's hesitation, he creates a tulpa of himself to make sure Janie E and Sonny Jim have, like, someone in their lives. I think that Cooper, and actually, to go further, in part 17, he felt that he had to rescue Laura. That, like, this was like the past dictates the future. And I know this scene is always a major point of contention for some people, but I think because of all the things that we're talking about, especially relating to Annie today, it shows that he does care for people, but he never understands the ramifications of what it does to others. And in the case of Annie, whether you want to say it's his failure, I personally don't think he failed in the Black Lodge or the Red Room. I think he actually succeeded. But he does make these problems, and it does actually seem like a lot of people's lives seem to get worse for it.
I think when I step away from the supernatural and the unknown aspects here, if I had to roll everything into some kind of point or takeaway, I think for me, it's that these people who are victimized, hurt, marginalized, not just in Twin Peaks, but in our world, they matter. And they don't have to be Laura Palmer to matter. They don't have to be the one to matter. I think for as important as Laura's struggle is, as core as it is to Twin Peaks, as relevant it is to so many people, I think that the stories of people like Ronette and Teresa and Annie really matter, as well as all the people who, like Diane or Audrey also face really traumatizing events, and some part of them survives, but they're never going to be the same. Those stories matter so much. And I remember in that long Twin Perfect video about Twin Peaks, the one on YouTube, there's this idea, I think it's pretty compelling, about viewing Twin Peaks as a response to typical television narratives. And Laura Palmer is important in that analysis as the victim who matters, that this is not just going to be a one and done case where someone died, we use it as a plot device, we move on, and it's never important again. This character is going to matter. Laura is going to be the one. And I think that that's true, that I think David Lynch and Mark Frost and the whole team crafted an impressive and incredible story all around what happened to Laura Palmer. But I think implicit in that idea, in the back of my mind, is that, again, shadow of Annie Blackburn, that people like Annie who end up becoming those same kind of victims that are discarded, we can't forget their stories. And I'd like to think that beyond any sort of potential continuity, beyond any sort of symbolism or meaning, I take from the idea that How's Annie matters because these people and what happens to them matters. How is Annie doing is an important question, regardless of the lore, regardless of everything else. Those stories matter.
I agree, and I've mentioned this on a few previous episodes, but I think of like in the pilot when Cooper has the town hall meeting, and he mentions how a year ago that Teresa Banks was murdered, and how it didn't even make front page news, or how Ronette, where she's kind of discarded, like she's the reason why Cooper's in Twin Peaks to begin with, but she's basically forgotten. Sarah Palmer, actually, had it not been for Lynch with the season 2 finale, her scene at Leland's Wake would have been her last scene. It just seems like, there's a lot about okay, I know Sarah Palmer, there's a lot more of that, but at least with Ronette and Teresa and Annie, that there's this like forgotten victim sort of thing. In the case of Teresa, it sets a precedent that it is written into the text of Twin Peaks, but also there's other factors where it's a bit more unintentional, but it still fits in, with Ronette and Annie in particular. So I do agree with you, is that like, I think that the fact that they are forgotten, that does add a great deal to like, the appeal of the characters, because there's always that feeling that like there should be more to that story. And in the case of Annie, I do wish that Fire Walk With Me was, it warranted a sequel in the 90s, because I think that would have been the only way we've gotten a feasible answer of how much Annie would have been integral to the story. Because the way Mark Frost wrote her in the final dossier, it kind of felt like he didn't really know what to do with her 25 years later. And to be fair, this applies for Lynch as well. But again, there's that whole forgotten victim aspect. And I feel like that still fits in. And what I was mentioned about Cooper, where it's like, no, the decisions he makes has very serious ramifications, where even though he wants to do the right thing, a lot of people are worse off when he's in their lives. Kind of like when Jean Reno, when he talked about how Twin Peaks was like, it was like this great place, but then the dream became the nightmare. And that if Cooper dies, that the nightmare might go away with him.
Yeah, I guess all I can really say, and you could decide to keep it or cut it because I don't know how strong of a sentiment it is, but I don't think that Annie Blackburn is the dreamer. I don't think that's even at all likely. But when I think of her character through that context, it does feel like her time in Twin Peaks, the town, and in Twin Peaks, the narrative, has proceeded like a dream turned into a nightmare. And even when she's not on screen, I think for those who felt something about her character and cared about her, her absence in The Return is also felt. And I know personally that I feel like there was a story to tell, and I would have wanted to see it told there. I'm glad that Mark Frost had taken the attempt to talk about Annie in the book. I wish, again, personally, it wasn't so sad, but to have any sort of recognition and acknowledgement of Annie's story at all is appreciated. It's one of those cases where this character was born out of necessity for a plot element, and once that use expired, what do you do with her? And that's kind of the fate of Annie Blackburn, a character written out of necessity.
One of the things I was thinking of is that that night when she won Miss Twin Peaks, that should have been like one of the best nights of her life up until that point, because she had a really sad life leading up to that.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, we don't know much about her time when she was in school. It seemed like she was like liked well enough, and she was at least separate from her parents. But that didn't change the fact that what she dealt with was like, at the led her to go to the convent, and she was opened up back to Norma, and it seemed like all things considered, things were pretty good. But to have that whiplash of this celebration of winning Miss Twin Peaks and being welcome, winning the hearts of, like, when I mentioned Dick Tremaine, even that, that she does have this good influence, but there's that hard cut to being kidnapped by Wyndham Earl, and then what we see happen in the Red Room and the events of the final dossier.
Going back to that motif of rooms and places, I think you could argue that for the first time, potentially in her entire life, it felt like doors had opened in front of her for possibilities. And then all at once, immediately, every door shut in her face. And again, I don't know if there's a character that's as tragic as that in all of Twin Peaks. There's certainly many others, but this is a kind of tragedy that I think warrants acknowledgement as well, that even someone whose minor role in the story touches upon so many different facets and aspects, she is, again, that idea of the weary traveler. I think there's so much that fits even with the book mentality there, that it saddens me again that she wasn't able to find a place and actually get to leave through any of those open doors. It feels like she ultimately ended up trapped.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's like we were saying before, is that that, like, that victim, there's people like Ronette or Diane where they had like horrible fates. If you believe the American Girl is Ronette, then, like, in part 3, then that would, people will make their decisions on that. But yeah, Annie is up there with, like, having like the most tragic, like, life throughout. Anyways, I think that ends up wrapping up everything as much as we can. But is there anything we should keep in mind before we wind down for today's episode?
No, I think that about sums up everything. Thank you so much for having me on again. It was great to be able to talk about Annie Blackburn and just for at least a moment in time, give her some attention and give her character a bit of justice through conversation and dialogue. So thank you for having me on again.